Get out of this hospital right now, Jimin. Don't you ever come near my son again. Jungkook's mother shouted so loudly that every nurse and doctor in the hallway stopped moving. Jimin froze where he stood, unable to believe the words he had just heard. If TAEHYUNG had been the one beside Jungkook, none of this would have happened. He protects Jungkook, but you only bring him pain. Those words shattered Jimin's heart in front of everyone. Seconds later, his vision blurred. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold hospital floor while the people around him screamed his name. But what nobody knew was that this heartbreaking moment was only the beginning of a secret that had been hidden for years. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Do you think Jungkook's mother was right, or did she make the biggest mistake of her life? Tell me your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from, because I always love seeing viewers from all around the world. If you enjoy emotional BTS fiction stories like this, please subscribe, like, and share this channel so you won't miss the next episode. Because today, we're uncovering an old moment that was never seen by the public, a hidden story that changes everything you thought you knew. No camera ever captured what happened after the hospital doors closed that day. The headlines never reported why Jungkook was rushed into emergency treatment, why JIMIN disappeared without saying a single word, or why TAEHYUNG locked himself inside the waiting room for nearly 3 hours without speaking to anyone. Everyone believed it was simply another difficult day for BTS, but the truth was far darker than anyone imagined. While JIMIN fought to hold himself together after being blamed for everything, SUGA quietly carried a secret powerful enough to destroy friendships that had lasted for years. And when he finally decided to reveal that secret to TAEHYUNG, the tears that followed would leave every single person in that hospital questioning who had really been protecting Jungkook all along, and who had been silently sacrificing everything from the beginning. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hospital corridor as doctors rushed Jungkook toward the emergency room, while nurses quickly cleared the path for the medical team. The automatic doors closed with a heavy thud, leaving everyone outside staring in complete silence. JIMIN remained frozen several meters away, unable to process everything that had happened within the last few minutes. His hands were still trembling, his breathing uneven, and his eyes never once left the red emergency light above the operating room door. Every second felt painfully slow. He kept replaying the same terrifying moment in his mind, wondering if there had been something, anything he could have done differently. Before he could take another step toward the emergency room, Jungkook's mother suddenly appeared at the end of the hallway. Her face was pale from fear, but the moment she saw JIMIN standing there, fear quickly turned into anger. She marched directly toward him without hesitation. Every member of BTS instinctively looked in her direction, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. RM quietly stepped forward, hoping to calm the situation before emotions exploded, but he stopped when he noticed the overwhelming pain in her expression. She stood only a few inches away from JIMIN, staring directly into his eyes. "Why are you still standing here?" she asked with a voice that shook the entire hallway. JIMIN tried to answer, but no words came out. "I'm asking you something." Her voice became louder. "Why are you here after everything you've done?" Every nurse nearby stopped pretending to work. Even the security guards exchanged nervous glances. Nobody dared interrupt. JIMIN finally lowered his head. I only wanted to make sure Jungkook was safe." His answer only made her angrier. "Safe?" she repeated bitterly. "You call this safe? My son is fighting inside that room, and you're telling me you wanted to keep him safe?" Jimin swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. Before he could explain, she pointed toward the emergency room with shaking hands. "If TAEHYUNG had been with him today, he would never have let this happen." Those words hit the hallway like a thunderstorm. TAEHYUNG's eyes widened in complete shock. He never expected his name to be dragged into the confrontation. Jimin slowly looked toward TAEHYUNG before lowering his eyes once again. Jungkook's mother continued without giving anyone a chance to respond. Taehyung has always protected Jungkook. He understands him. He knows when something is wrong. But you... She paused just long enough for every word to hurt even more. You only bring him pain. The silence that followed was unbearable. Jimin felt as if the ground beneath his feet had disappeared. He wanted to explain that things were not as simple as they seemed. He wanted to tell everyone what had really happened before Jungkook collapsed, but he couldn't, because the promise he had made to Jungkook only hours earlier still echoed inside his mind. No matter what happens, don't tell anyone. That promise now felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. Jin quietly took one step toward Jimin. "Maybe we should all calm down first," he said softly. But Jungkook's mother immediately shook her head. "No, I've stayed quiet for too long." Her voice cracked as tears rolled down her face. "Every time my son gets hurt, Jimin is somehow involved." Jimin closed his eyes. Those words hurt far more than he expected, because he knew she truly believed them. J-Hope looked at RM with growing concern. Neither of them knew the full story, but something about Jimin's silence didn't feel like guilt. It felt like protection. SUGA had been standing near the window the entire time without saying a single word. Unlike everyone else, his expression didn't show confusion. It showed conflict. He knew something he had promised never to reveal. Taehyung noticed the unusual look on SUGA's face almost immediately. He had known SUGA long enough to recognize when he was hiding something important, but this wasn't the time to ask questions. Across the hallway, JIMIN suddenly tried to speak again. "Please, believe me, I never wanted Jungkook to get hurt." His voice was barely above a whisper. Jungkook's mother looked at him with heartbreaking disappointment. "Intentions don't change what happened." She slowly pointed toward the hospital exit. "Leave." JIMIN didn't move. She repeated herself, louder this time. "Leave this hospital." RM immediately stepped between them. "Please, everyone is emotional right now." "No," she answered firmly. "If he truly cares about Jungkook, then the best thing he can do is stay away from him." Those words completely shattered whatever strength JIMIN had left. He took one slow step backward, then another. His vision became blurry. The voices around him sounded distant, almost underwater. He couldn't hear Jin calling his name. He couldn't hear J-Hope asking someone to bring a chair. All he could hear were the painful words repeating inside his head. "You only bring him pain. You only bring him pain. You only bring him pain." Suddenly, his knees gave out. His body collapsed onto the polished hospital floor with a loud impact that echoed through the corridor. Everyone gasped at once. Taehyung rushed forward first. "JIMIN!" RM and Jin immediately knelt beside him, while nurses hurried over with emergency equipment. JIMIN's face had turned completely pale. His breathing was shallow, and tears continued sliding silently from the corners of his closed eyes. Even unconscious, he looked heartbroken. Jungkook's mother stared at him in complete shock. She never imagined her words would push him this far. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, doubt appeared in her eyes. Had she misunderstood something? Before anyone could react further, the emergency room doors suddenly opened. A doctor stepped outside with an expression that instantly erased every other thought in the hallway. "Who is Park JIMIN?" the doctor asked urgently. Everyone looked toward JIMIN lying unconscious on the floor. The doctor frowned. "Then we have an even bigger problem than I expected." No one understood what he meant, but SUGA did. And at that exact moment, the secret he had been protecting was about to destroy every relationship standing inside that hospital. Nobody answered the doctor's question immediately. The entire hallway stood frozen as every pair of eyes shifted between the unconscious JIMIN on the floor and the anxious doctor waiting for a response. RM finally stepped forward. "I'm RM. What happened? Why are you looking for JIMIN?" The doctor glanced at the unconscious man before taking a slow breath. Because before Jungkook lost consciousness, he gave us one instruction over and over again. He kept asking us not to begin a certain procedure until Park Jimin arrived. The words landed like another shockwave. Jungkook's mother stared at the doctor in disbelief. That can't be right. The doctor nodded seriously. He repeated Jimin's name several times despite his condition. He was extremely determined. Jimin's unconscious body remained motionless while everyone struggled to understand why Jungkook would insist on seeing him during such a critical moment. TAEHYUNG slowly looked toward Jimin with growing confusion. Only minutes earlier, everyone had been led to believe Jimin was the reason Jungkook had ended up in the hospital. Now, the first thing Jungkook had done inside the emergency room was ask for him. Jin quietly whispered, "Something doesn't add up." J-Hope nodded without taking his eyes off Jimin. There's a piece of this story we're missing. Jungkook's mother clenched her hands tightly. She wanted to reject what the doctor had just said, but she could see there was no hesitation in his expression. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Before anyone could ask another question, another doctor emerged carrying a medical chart. He walked directly to his colleague and spoke quietly enough that only fragments of the conversation could be heard. Even so, one sentence reached everyone's ears. The patient refused until Jimin agreed. RM's eyes immediately widened. TAEHYUNG turned towards Suna almost instinctively, searching for any sign that someone already knew what was happening. SUGA lowered his gaze. His silence had become impossible to ignore. TAEHYUNG turned closer. "Hyung," he said quietly, "you know something, don't you?" SUGA didn't answer. Instead, he looked through the small window in the emergency room door, where doctors continued working around Jungkook. His expression grew heavier with every passing second. TAEHYUNG frowned. "Please, tell me." SUGA finally spoke, but his voice was barely audible. "This isn't the place." That answer only deepened TAEHYUNG's suspicion. Back near JIMIN, the nurses carefully lifted him onto a hospital bed to examine him. One of them checked his blood pressure before exchanging a worried look with another nurse. "His stress level is dangerously high," she whispered. "He's been carrying this for much longer than today." Jungkook's mother overheard those words and slowly looked away. Guilt quietly began replacing her anger. She remembered the expression on Jimin's face while she accused him. It hadn't been defensive. It had been devastated. Meanwhile, inside the emergency room, Jungkook briefly regained consciousness. His eyes opened only halfway, but the first word that escaped his lips wasn't Mom. It wasn't TAEHYUNG. It wasn't anyone else's name. Jimin. The doctor immediately leaned closer. "Jungkook, we're here. Stay with us." Jungkook weakly grabbed the doctor's sleeve. "Don't blame him." Those three words changed everything. The doctor looked directly at Jungkook. "Who shouldn't we blame?" Jungkook struggled to breathe. "Jimin didn't do anything." His strength faded again before he could continue. The monitor beside him beeped faster as doctors immediately returned to stabilizing his condition. Outside, nobody had heard those words except the medical staff. But only seconds later, the doctor walked back into the hallway with a completely different expression than before. He looked directly at Jungkook's mother. "I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding." Every heartbeat in the hallway seemed to stop. "Your son specifically told us not to blame Jimin for what happened." Complete silence followed. Jungkook's mother's face slowly lost all color. RM closed his eyes for a brief moment, while Jin quietly exhaled in relief. J-Hope placed a hand over his mouth, unable to believe how quickly everything had changed. TAEHYUNG looked toward Jimin lying unconscious on the nearby bed. "Then why?" he whispered. "Why didn't he defend himself?" Nobody answered because nobody knew, except one person. SUGA slowly walked toward the window overlooking the city lights outside the hospital. His reflection stared back at him like a stranger. The promise he had made weeks earlier now felt impossible to keep. He remembered every conversation, every warning, every sacrifice JIMIN had made without expecting anyone to understand. He had promised Jungkook that no matter what happened, the truth would remain buried. But after watching JIMIN collapse under accusations he didn't deserve, SUGA began questioning whether keeping that promise was still the right thing to do. TAEHYUNG quietly approached him again. This time, his voice carried desperation instead of curiosity. "Hyung, if JIMIN isn't responsible, then what really happened?" SUGA closed his eyes. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then he slowly opened his eyes and looked directly at TAEHYUNG. There was sadness, exhaustion, and regret written across his face. "If I tell you the truth," SUGA whispered, "nothing between us will ever be the same again." TAEHYUNG's heartbeat quickened. He had never seen SUGA look so conflicted. Before he could respond, the waiting room television suddenly switched to a breaking entertainment news report. Reporters had somehow learned that Jungkook had been admitted to the hospital. Outside the building, dozens of cameras were already gathering, desperate to discover what had happened. The peaceful hallway instantly transformed into a place surrounded by pressure, fear, and unwanted attention. RM looked through the glass entrance and saw the growing crowd of reporters. "We don't have much time," he said quietly. "Once the media starts creating their own story, everything will spiral out of control." SUGA lowered his head once more. He knew RM was right. The truth could no longer stay hidden forever, but revealing it would expose a sacrifice that JIMIN had spent months trying to protect, and it would force Jungkook to confront a decision that could change every relationship inside BTS forever.
The atmosphere inside the hospital changed completely as the crowd outside continued to grow. Camera flashes could already be seen through the glass entrance, and hospital security hurried to keep reporters from entering the building. Every member of BTS understood that once rumors began spreading, the truth would become almost impossible to control. RM quietly rubbed his forehead, trying to think several steps ahead, but even he realized this situation was slipping beyond anyone's control. At the same time, JIMIN slowly began regaining consciousness. His eyelids felt unbearably heavy, and every breath reminded him of the emotional pain he had tried so hard to suppress. The first thing he heard was the faint sound of hospital monitors somewhere nearby. The second was the memory of Jungkook's mother's heartbreaking accusation repeating endlessly inside his mind. He slowly opened his eyes and immediately tried to sit up, but a nurse gently stopped him. "Please don't move too quickly," she said softly. "You've been under severe emotional stress." JIMIN barely acknowledged her words. His eyes searched the hallway until they found the emergency room doors. "Jungkook," he whispered. "How is Jungkook?" The nurse hesitated before answering. "He's stable for now." Those 4 words should have brought relief, yet JIMIN's expression remained painfully empty. Stable did not mean safe. Stable did not erase what had happened. Before the nurse could say anything else, JIMIN slowly removed the monitoring clip from his finger and tried to stand. His legs trembled violently beneath him. Jin immediately rushed over and supported his shoulder. "Don't do this," Jin said gently. "You need to rest." JIMIN slowly shook his head. "I can't." "Why?" Jin asked. "Because if Jungkook wakes up and I'm not here." JIMIN stopped speaking before finishing the sentence. Jin looked directly into his eyes. There was fear there, but not fear for himself. Fear for Jungkook. It was the kind of fear someone carried when protecting another person mattered more than protecting themselves. Across the hallway, Jungkook's mother quietly watched the interaction. The anger that had filled her earlier was slowly being replaced by confusion. She had expected resentment after everything she had said. Instead, Jimin's only concern was whether Jungkook was awake. She lowered her eyes, unable to ignore the guilt growing inside her heart. Nearby, TAEHYUNG continued watching SUGA. The older member had remained unusually silent for nearly an hour. Every time someone mentioned Jimin or Jungkook, SUGA looked as though he wanted to speak, only to stop himself at the last second. Finally, TAEHYUNG could no longer endure the uncertainty. He gently touched SUGA's arm. "Hyung, come with me." SUGA looked at him for several seconds before silently nodding. The two quietly walked away from the others and entered an empty family consultation room at the end of the hallway. The room was small and silent. The only sound came from the ticking clock hanging above the door. TAEHYUNG closed the door behind them before turning towards SUGA. "No one else is here," he said quietly. "Please, tell me what's really happening." SUGA remained standing near the window with his back facing TAEHYUNG. He stared at the city lights outside without saying a single word. Nearly a full minute passed before he finally spoke. "Do you remember 3 months ago," he asked quietly, "when Jungkook suddenly canceled all his personal schedules for almost 2 weeks? TAEHYUNG immediately nodded. Everyone said he was exhausted. SUGA slowly looked over his shoulder. That wasn't the real reason. TAEHYUNG felt his heartbeat quicken. SUGA took a slow breath before continuing. Jungkook collapsed once before. TAEHYUNG's eyes widened. "What? Almost no one knows." SUGA's voice remained calm, but every word carried enormous weight. The company covered it. The doctors ordered complete rest. But Jungkook refused because he didn't want fans to worry. TAEHYUNG struggled to process what he was hearing. Why didn't anyone tell us? SUGA lowered his eyes. Because Jungkook didn't want everyone treating him differently. The room fell silent again. Then TAEHYUNG asked the question that had been haunting him all afternoon. Where was Jimin? SUGA slowly closed his eyes. Right beside him. TAEHYUNG frowned. Then why does everyone think Jimin caused today's accident? SUGA's fingers tightened into a fist. Because that's exactly what Jimin wanted everyone to believe. TAEHYUNG stared at him in complete disbelief. What are you talking about? SUGA turned around completely for the first time. His eyes were filled with sadness. Every medical appointment, every late-night hospital visit, every medication schedule, every emergency warning. He paused before quietly adding, Jimin handled all of it. TAEHYUNG felt the room spinning around him. No, he whispered. That's impossible. It's true. SUGA nodded. Jungkook never wanted the members to know how serious things had become. Jimin promised to protect that secret. He became the only person who knew every warning the doctors had given. TAEHYUNG took several slow steps backward until he reached the wall behind him. Memories suddenly flooded back into his mind. Jimin disappearing after rehearsals. Jimin constantly checking his phone during concerts. Jimin quietly leaving award ceremonies early without explaining why. At the time, everyone assumed he simply needed rest. Now every memory suddenly carried a completely different meaning. SUGA continued speaking. Whenever Jungkook said he was fine, Jimin was the one making sure he actually was. TAEHYUNG lowered his head. Then, today's collapse. SUGA nodded once. Jimin tried to stop it before it happened. Why didn't he tell us? TAEHYUNG asked with tears beginning to form in his eyes. Because Jungkook begged him not to. The silence became unbearable. TAEHYUNG slowly covered his face with one hand. Everything he believed over the past few hours had been completely wrong. He had watched Jimin blamed for something he had desperately tried to prevent. Worse still, Jimin had accepted every accusation without defending himself simply to keep Jungkook's promise. A soft knock suddenly interrupted the conversation. RM carefully opened the consultation room door. One look at SUGA's expression told him something important had just happened. The doctor needs all of us, RM said quietly. Jungkook is awake again, and he's asking to see only 2 people. SUGA and TAEHYUNG immediately looked at each other. RM slowly swallowed before finishing his sentence. He asked for Jimin, and he specifically asked that his mother wait outside. The hallway was about to witness a conversation capable of changing everything. A heavy silence settled over the hallway the moment RM finished speaking. No one moved for several seconds. Even Jungkook's mother looked stunned after hearing that her son had specifically asked to see Jimin instead of anyone else. She instinctively took one step toward the emergency room, but the doctor gently raised his hand. "I'm sorry," he said respectfully. "These were Jungkook's own instructions. He asked that only Park Jimin come inside first." The disappointment on her face was impossible to hide. She slowly nodded. Though it was obvious, she struggled to understand why her son had made such a request after everything that had happened. Meanwhile, Jimin stood silently near the wall, still looking weak from his collapse. His breathing remained uneven, and the nurse had repeatedly warned him that he should not be walking yet. But the moment he heard Jungkook was awake, every trace of physical exhaustion seemed to disappear. His eyes immediately turned toward the emergency room door. Jin gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to force yourself." Jimin smiled faintly, but it was a smile filled with sadness rather than relief. "If Jungkook is asking for me," he whispered, "then I have to go." RM carefully studied Jimin's face. There was no anger, no resentment, no bitterness toward the people who had just blamed him, only concern for Jungkook. It reminded RM why Jimin had always been the type of person who silently carried burdens without expecting anyone to notice. As Jimin slowly walked toward the emergency room, Jungkook's mother quietly lowered her eyes. The memory of her own words echoed painfully inside her mind. "You only bring him pain." Looking at Jimin now, she could not find a single trace of selfishness in his actions. Instead, she saw someone who looked emotionally exhausted, but still refused to think about himself. She wanted to stop him. She wanted to apologize, but the words refused to come out. The automatic door slowly opened, and Jimin disappeared inside the room. The door closed behind him, leaving everyone outside with nothing but silence. Inside the room, the atmosphere was completely different. The bright medical lights reflected against countless machines surrounding Jungkook's bed. Tubes, monitors, and intravenous lines filled the small space. Jungkook looked noticeably weaker than usual. His normally confident expression had been replaced by exhaustion, yet the moment he saw Jimin enter the room, his tense shoulders relaxed for the first time since arriving at the hospital. Jimin quietly approached the bed without saying anything. For several long seconds, the two simply looked at each other. Neither of them needed words to understand how much pain the other had endured during the past few hours. Finally, Jungkook spoke first. "I'm sorry." His voice was barely above a whisper. Jimin immediately shook his head. "Don't apologize." Jungkook looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "Because of me, you got hurt again." Jimin slowly pulled a chair beside the bed before sitting down. "The only thing that matters is that you're alive." Jungkook closed his eyes for a brief moment. "My mother," Jimin interrupted him gently. "Don't." Jungkook looked back at him with guilt written all over his face. "She shouldn't have said those things." Jimin forced another faint smile. "She was scared. She blamed you because she loves you." Jungkook's hands trembled slightly above the blanket, but she was wrong. Jimin quietly lowered his gaze. "It doesn't matter." Jungkook immediately frowned. "It matters to me." The room became silent again. Outside the glass window, the members could only see the two talking quietly, unable to hear a single word. TAEHYUNG stared at them with a completely different perspective, now that SUGA had revealed part of the truth. Every small gesture between Jimin and Jungkook suddenly carried meaning he had never noticed before. Inside the room, Jungkook slowly reached toward the bedside drawer with visible difficulty. His fingers searched for a small sealed envelope that had been placed there before surgery. He carefully handed it to Jimin. "Keep this." Jimin frowned. "What is it?" Jungkook answered without hesitation. "If something happens to me," Jimin immediately cut him off. "Don't say that," Jungkook continued anyway. "Promise me." Jimin stared at the envelope without touching it. Jungkook, promise me. His voice became stronger despite his condition. If I can't tell everyone myself, you have to. Jimin slowly realized what was inside the envelope. His expression immediately changed. No. Jungkook nodded weakly. It's time. Jimin's breathing became heavier. They're not ready. Jungkook looked directly into his eyes. Neither are we. For nearly a full minute, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jimin accepted the envelope with shaking hands, holding it as though it weighed far more than paper ever could. I never wanted this secret to come out like this, he whispered. Jungkook sadly smiled. Neither did I. Outside the room, TAEHYUNG noticed Jimin holding something. What's in his hand? He quietly asked. SUGA immediately recognized the envelope from the moment he saw it through the glass. His face instantly turned pale. No, he whispered almost to himself. RM looked toward him. You know what that is? SUGA slowly nodded. I was hoping they'd never have to open it. Jin looked back through the window. What's inside? SUGA hesitated for several seconds before quietly answering. Everything. At that exact moment, the hospital lights briefly flickered. Seconds later, every monitor inside Jungkook's room suddenly began sounding rapid warning alarms. Doctors and nurses rushed toward the emergency room from every direction. Jimin immediately stood from his chair in panic as medical staff pushed him away from the bed. Through the glass, the BTS members watched doctors surrounding Jungkook once again while the envelope slipped from Jimin's trembling hands and fell onto the floor. It landed partially open. A single photograph slowly slid out onto the white hospital tiles. Before anyone could pick it up, TAEHYUNG caught a brief glimpse of the image inside. And the moment he recognized what he was looking at, his entire body froze. Because the photograph proved that everything everyone had believed about Jimin for the past several months had been a complete lie. And the real reason Jungkook had hidden the truth was far more heartbreaking than any of them had ever imagined. The piercing alarm from Jungkook's room echoed through the entire hospital floor as doctors and nurses rushed inside without wasting a single second. The automatic doors shut immediately, leaving the BTS members staring helplessly through the narrow glass windows. Inside, medical staff surrounded Jungkook's bed so quickly that Jimin could no longer see him. One of the nurses gently but firmly guided Jimin toward the corner of the room, asking him to stay out of the way while the doctors worked. Jimin obeyed without resistance, but his eyes never left Jungkook for even a moment. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely breathe. On the floor beside him, the envelope remained open where it had fallen. The photograph that had slipped out lay face up against the white tiles. Outside the room, TAEHYUNG could only catch a partial glimpse through the glass before one of the nurses accidentally stepped over it, covering the image from view. But even that brief moment had been enough to send a chill through his entire body. The expression on his face changed so dramatically that RM immediately noticed. TAEHYUNG? RM asked quietly. TAEHYUNG slowly turned toward him, still trying to process what he had just witnessed. I don't think I saw it clearly. His voice trembled, but if I'm right. He stopped speaking before finishing the sentence. Jin stepped closer. Right about what? TAEHYUNG swallowed hard. That picture. His breathing became uneven. Looked like it was taken inside another hospital. RM frowned. Another hospital? TAEHYUNG nodded slowly. And I think, he hesitated again. I think Jimin was wearing a patient bracelet. Those words instantly caught SUGA's attention. His eyes closed for a brief moment, almost as if he had expected this exact moment to arrive eventually. J-Hope looked at SUGA with growing concern. Hyung, please don't tell me, Jimin. SUGA quietly lowered his head. I warned them this day would come. RM immediately looked at him. Warned who? Jimin and Jungkook. SUGA finally raised his eyes again. They were filled with exhaustion. I told them secrets like this never stay buried forever. Before anyone could ask another question, the emergency room doors suddenly opened again. A doctor quickly stepped outside, looking directly at RM. "We need someone to sign an additional consent form immediately." RM accepted the paperwork without hesitation, but his attention quickly shifted toward the doctor's unusually serious expression. "Is Jungkook getting worse?" The doctor remained professional, but his answer carried obvious concern. "He's stable for the moment, but we're dealing with complications we already knew might happen." RM froze. "Already knew?" The doctor nodded before realizing he had revealed more than intended. He stopped himself immediately. "I'm sorry, that's confidential." RM slowly looked towards SUGA, who silently closed his eyes again. Another confirmation. Someone had known far more about Jungkook's condition than the rest of the members. Across the hallway, Jungkook's mother remained seated with both hands tightly clasped together. Every few seconds she looked toward the emergency room, silently praying for her son's recovery. Then her eyes slowly drifted toward JIMIN through the glass. She watched him standing completely alone inside the room, refusing to leave Jungkook's side despite everything she had said earlier. The guilt inside her heart continued growing heavier. She quietly remembered another day years ago when Jungkook had first introduced JIMIN to her family. They had laughed together during dinner. She remembered how naturally JIMIN had cared for everyone around him without expecting attention. Somewhere along the way, fear had replaced trust, and now she could no longer tell whether her fear had blinded her to the truth. Meanwhile, inside the emergency room, the alarms gradually became quieter. As the doctors succeeded in stabilizing Jungkook once again, JIMIN remained exactly where the nurses had asked him to stand. He never complained. He never interrupted. He simply watched, silently hoping Jungkook would open his eyes again. One of the senior doctors finally approached him. "He's responding." JIMIN released a breath he didn't even realize he had been holding. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded. For a few minutes, JIMIN slowly returned to Jungkook's bedside. Jungkook's eyes were still closed, but he could hear JIMIN's footsteps approaching. Without opening his eyes, he whispered only one word. "Still. Here?" JIMIN gently smiled despite the tears threatening to fall. "I told you." He quietly sat beside him again. "I'm not going anywhere." Jungkook slowly opened his eyes. Even in his weakened condition, relief spread across his face. "Did anyone see it?" JIMIN immediately understood what he meant. He looked toward the envelope lying on the nearby table, where one of the nurses had placed everything back together. "I don't know." Jungkook closed his eyes again. "If they did," his voice weakened, "everything changes." JIMIN looked down at the envelope. Maybe it was always going to happen. Jungkook slowly shook his head. "Not like this." Outside the room, TAEHYUNG stood motionless near the glass, unable to stop thinking about the image he had almost recognized. The more he replayed it in his mind, the more certain he became that it wasn't an ordinary photograph. It looked like evidence that connected JIMIN to something none of them had ever been told. He suddenly remembered dozens of small moments from the past that he had ignored. JIMIN quietly disappearing during overseas tours. Jungkook canceling practice without explanation. SUGA making unexpected late-night trips that no one questioned. Individually, none of those memories seemed important. Together, they formed a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. TAEHYUNG slowly turned towards SUGA once again. This time there was no hesitation in his voice. "HAEHYUNG," he said quietly. "Was JIMIN ever a patient too?" The question hung in the air between them. SUGA didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked through the glass at JIMIN gently adjusting Jungkook's blanket, before sitting quietly beside him again. A faint smile appeared on SUGA's face, but it carried more sadness than comfort. Finally, after several long seconds, he spoke. "You're asking the wrong question." TAEHYUNG frowned. "Then what's the right question?" SUGA slowly looked directly into his eyes. "You shouldn't be asking whether JIMIN was ever a patient." His expression became painfully serious. You should be asking why Jungkook insisted on becoming one instead. The color drained from TAEHYUNG's face as those words echoed inside his mind. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, he realized the truth might not be about an accident at all, but about a choice Jungkook had willingly made, a choice that Jimin had desperately tried to stop, and a sacrifice that none of them were prepared to understand.
TAEHYUNG remained completely speechless after hearing SUGA's answer. The words refused to leave his mind. You should be asking why Jungkook insisted on becoming one instead. The sentence sounded less like an explanation and more like the beginning of an even greater mystery. He searched SUGA's face, hoping to find some sign that he had misunderstood, but SUGA's expression remained painfully calm. It was the face of someone who had carried a burden for far too long. RM stepped closer after noticing the tension between them. What did he mean? He asked quietly. TAEHYUNG looked at SUGA before answering. He says this wasn't just an accident. RM slowly frowned. Then what was it? SUGA remained silent for several moments before finally speaking. Months ago, Jungkook made a decision that none of us could stop. Jin immediately looked up. What decision? SUGA rubbed his tired eyes. One that Jimin argued against every single day. J-Hope's heartbeat quickened. Hyung, stop speaking in pieces, just tell us. SUGA took a deep breath, but before he could continue, the consultation room door opened behind them. The senior doctor walked toward the group while holding a tablet containing Jungkook's latest medical results. His condition has stabilized again, the doctor announced. Everyone released a breath of relief. However, the relief disappeared instantly. There are several questions we need answered. RM nodded. Ask us anything. The doctor looked around the group before stopping at SUGA. Which one of you has been helping Jungkook follow his treatment plan? No one answered immediately. Finally, SUGA slowly pointed toward the emergency room. Jimin! The doctor nodded as though confirming something he had already suspected. That explains why he understood the medication schedule without asking us any questions. Jungkook's mother immediately stood from her chair. Medication schedule. The doctor looked at her with surprise. You weren't informed. Her confused expression answered the question for him. The doctor immediately realized he had unintentionally revealed another secret. He carefully chose his next words. I'm sorry, I assumed the family already knew. The hallway became silent once again. Jungkook's mother slowly looked toward SUGA. What medication? She asked softly. SUGA closed his eyes. He could no longer avoid the truth forever. Jungkook has been receiving treatment for months. Her face turned completely pale. Months, SUGA nodded once. He didn't want anyone to worry. Tears immediately filled her eyes. I'm his mother. Her voice cracked. How could I not know? No one answered because the answer was standing only a few meters away inside the emergency room. Jimin had protected Jungkook's decision even from the people who loved him most. Meanwhile, inside the room, Jungkook noticed the worried expression on Jimin's face. They're starting to figure it out. Jimin quietly nodded. I know. Jungkook slowly looked toward the ceiling. Maybe we should have told them sooner. Jimin remained silent for several seconds before replying. You weren't ready. Jungkook sadly smiled. Neither were you. Jimin couldn't deny it. Every hospital visit over the past several months had become another reminder of the promise he had made. He had watched Jungkook force himself through rehearsals, concerts, interviews, and endless schedules while pretending everything was normal. More than once, Jimin had begged him to slow down. More than once, Jungkook had refused. Jimin remembered one particular night after practice when Jungkook had nearly collapsed from exhaustion. The rehearsal room had already emptied, leaving only the two of them behind. Jimin had immediately grabbed his arm before he could fall. That's enough, Jimin had said firmly. We're going to the hospital. Jungkook had pulled his arm away. I have another recording tomorrow. Forget tomorrow. I can't. Jimin had stared at him in frustration. Do you think your fans would rather see you on stage or alive? Jungkook had remained silent for nearly a full minute before quietly answering, If I stop now, everyone will ask why. Jimin had shaken his head. Let them ask, but Jungkook had smiled sadly. You know I can't. That memory disappeared as Jimin returned to the present. He slowly looked at Jungkook lying in the hospital bed. Nothing had changed. Jungkook was still trying to protect everyone except himself. Outside the room, TAEHYUNG continued processing everything SUGA had revealed. Every answer created two new questions. If Jimin has been helping Jungkook all this time, TAEHYUNG whispered, why keep it secret from us? SUGA looked directly at him. Because Jungkook believed the burden belonged to him alone, RM quietly added, and Jimin refused to let him carry it alone. SUGA nodded. Exactly. Jungkook's mother slowly approached the glass window overlooking the emergency room. She watched Jimin carefully adjusting Jungkook's pillow before quietly checking the monitor beside the bed. He moved with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. Suddenly, she realized something that made her chest tighten. Jimin wasn't asking the nurses what to do. He already knew. He knew which medication came next. He knew how to calm Jungkook whenever the machines began beeping faster. He knew where every medical document was placed. Those weren't things someone learned in a single afternoon. Those were habits built over months. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks as she finally understood how much of her son's suffering had remained hidden from her. At that exact moment, one of the younger nurses approached the front desk, carrying a stack of archived medical files that had been transferred from another hospital earlier that day. While organizing them, one folder accidentally slipped from her hands and landed on the reception counter. Several documents scattered across the surface. Before the nurse could gather them, TAEHYUNG's eyes instinctively landed on one page lying face up. Across the top of the document, in bold letters, was a hospital admission date from several months earlier. Below it were two names listed under emergency contact information. The first was Jeon Jungkook. The second made TAEHYUNG's entire body freeze. It wasn't a family member. It wasn't a manager. It wasn't the company. The document identified Park Jimin as Jungkook's primary emergency contact. And beneath that, written in Jungkook's own signature, was a handwritten instruction that read, "If I am unconscious, let Jimin make every medical decision on my behalf." TAEHYUNG could no longer breathe normally, because the person everyone had blamed only hours earlier was the very person Jungkook had trusted more than anyone else when his own life was on the line. TAEHYUNG remained completely speechless after hearing SUGA's answer. The words refused to leave his mind. You should be asking why Jungkook insisted on becoming one instead. The sentence sounded less like an explanation and more like the beginning of an even greater mystery. He searched SUGA's face, hoping to find some sign that he had misunderstood, but SUGA's expression remained painfully calm. It was the face of someone who had carried a burden for far too long. RM stepped closer after noticing the tension between them. What did he mean? He asked quietly. TAEHYUNG looked at SUGA before answering. He says this wasn't just an accident. RM slowly frowned. Then what was it? SUGA remained silent for several moments before finally speaking. Months ago, Jungkook made a decision that none of us could stop. Jin immediately looked up. What decision? SUGA rubbed his tired eyes. One that Jimin argued against every single day. J-Hope's heartbeat quickened. Hyung, stop speaking in pieces, just tell us. SUGA took a deep breath, but before he could continue, the consultation room door opened behind them. The senior doctor walked toward the group while holding a tablet containing Jungkook's latest medical results. His condition has stabilized again, the doctor announced. Everyone released a breath of relief. However, the relief disappeared instantly. There are several questions we need answered. RM nodded. Ask us anything. The doctor looked around the group before stopping at SUGA. Which one of you has been helping Jungkook follow his treatment plan? No one answered immediately. Finally, SUGA slowly pointed toward the emergency room. Jimin. The doctor nodded as though confirming something he had already suspected. That explains why he understood the medication schedule without asking us any questions. Jungkook's mother immediately stood from her chair. Medication schedule. The doctor looked at her with surprise. You weren't informed. Her confused expression answered the question for him. The doctor immediately realized he had unintentionally revealed another secret. He carefully chose his next words. I'm sorry, I assumed the family already knew. The hallway became silent once again. Jungkook's mother slowly looked toward SUGA. What medication? She asked softly. SUGA closed his eyes. He could no longer avoid the truth forever. Jungkook has been receiving treatment for months. Her face turned completely pale. Months, SUGA nodded once. He didn't want anyone to worry. Tears immediately filled her eyes. I'm his mother. Her voice cracked. How could I not know? No one answered because the answer was standing only a few meters away inside the emergency room. Jimin had protected Jungkook's decision even from the people who loved him most. Meanwhile, inside the room, Jungkook noticed the worried expression on Jimin's face. They're starting to figure it out. Jimin quietly nodded. I know. Jungkook slowly looked toward the ceiling. Maybe we should have told them sooner. Jimin remained silent for several seconds before replying. You weren't ready. Jungkook sadly smiled. Neither were you. Jimin couldn't deny it. Every hospital visit over the past several months had become another reminder of the promise he had made. He had watched Jungkook force himself through rehearsals, concerts, interviews, and endless schedules while pretending everything was normal. More than once, Jimin had begged him to slow down. More than once, Jungkook had refused. Jimin remembered one particular night after practice when Jungkook had nearly collapsed from exhaustion. The rehearsal room had already emptied, leaving only the two of them behind. Jimin had immediately grabbed his arm before he could fall. That's enough, Jimin had said firmly. We're going to the hospital. Jungkook had pulled his arm away. I have another recording tomorrow. Forget tomorrow. I can't. Jimin had stared at him in frustration. Do you think your fans would rather see you on stage or alive? Jungkook had remained silent for nearly a full minute before quietly answering, If I stop now, everyone will ask why. Jimin had shaken his head. Let them ask. But Jungkook had smiled sadly. You know I can't. That memory disappeared as Jimin returned to the present. He slowly looked at Jungkook lying in the hospital bed. Nothing had changed. Jungkook was still trying to protect everyone except himself. Outside the room, TAEHYUNG continued processing everything SUGA had revealed. Every answer created two new questions. If Jimin has been helping Jungkook all this time, TAEHYUNG whispered, why keep it secret from us? SUGA looked directly at him. Because Jungkook believed the burden belonged to him alone, RM quietly added, and Jimin refused to let him carry it alone. SUGA nodded. Exactly. Jungkook's mother slowly approached the glass window overlooking the emergency room. She watched Jimin carefully adjusting Jungkook's pillow before quietly checking the monitor beside the bed. He moved with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. Suddenly, she realized something that made her chest tighten. Jimin wasn't asking the nurses what to do. He already knew. He knew which medication came next. He knew how to calm Jungkook whenever the machines began beeping faster. He knew where every medical document was placed. Those weren't things someone learned in a single afternoon. Those were habits built over months. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks as she finally understood how much of her son's suffering had remained hidden from her. At that exact moment, one of the younger nurses approached the front desk, carrying a stack of archived medical files that had been transferred from another hospital earlier that day. While organizing them, one folder accidentally slipped from her hands and landed on the reception counter. Several documents scattered across the surface. Before the nurse could gather them, TAEHYUNG's eyes instinctively landed on one page lying face up. Across the top of the document, in bold letters, was a hospital admission date from several months earlier. Below it were two names listed under emergency contact information. The first was Jeon Jungkook. The second made TAEHYUNG's entire body freeze. It wasn't a family member. It wasn't a manager. It wasn't the company. The document identified Park Jimin as Jungkook's primary emergency contact, and beneath that, written in Jungkook's own signature, was a handwritten instruction that read, If I am unconscious, let Jimin make every medical decision on my behalf. TAEHYUNG could no longer breathe normally. Because the person everyone had blamed only hours earlier was the very person Jungkook had trusted more than anyone else when his own life was on the line. TAEHYUNG could not take his eyes off the document lying on the reception counter. His heartbeat pounded so loudly that he barely heard the nurse apologizing as she hurried to gather the scattered papers. Before she could pick up the page, TAEHYUNG had already memorized every important detail. There was no misunderstanding. The signature belonged to Jungkook. The handwriting was unmistakable. The instruction was painfully clear. If Jungkook ever became unable to speak for himself, Jimin would make every medical decision, not his family, not the company, not the members, Jimin. The realization hit TAEHYUNG harder than anything he had experienced that day. He slowly stepped backward, struggling to understand how such an enormous responsibility had been hidden from everyone. RM noticed the change in TAEHYUNG's expression immediately. What happened? He asked quietly. TAEHYUNG looked at him, but for several seconds no words came out. Finally, he whispered, Jungkook trusted Jimin with his life. The sentence immediately caught everyone's attention. Jin frowned. What do you mean? TAEHYUNG slowly repeated what he had seen on the document. As every word left his mouth, the hallway became quieter. Jungkook's mother covered her mouth with both hands. J-Hope stared at the emergency room without blinking. Even RM, who rarely showed surprise, found himself speechless. SUGA simply lowered his head. None of this shocked him because he had witnessed the moment Jungkook signed those papers months earlier. He remembered sitting beside Jungkook in the private consultation room while the hospital administrator explained the legal documents. The administrator had politely asked who should be listed as the primary emergency contact. Without even pausing to think, Jungkook had answered, "Park Jimin." SUGA had looked at him with confusion. "Shouldn't you ask your family first?" Jungkook had quietly shaken his head. "My family loves me." He had smiled faintly before adding, "But Jimin knows what I want even when I can't explain it." SUGA had never forgotten those words. They carried a level of trust that went far beyond ordinary friendship. Back in the present, Jungkook's mother slowly walked towards SUGA. Tears continued running down her face. "You knew?" she asked softly. SUGA nodded once. "Yes. For how long?" "Since the first hospital visit." She closed her eyes. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" SUGA answered honestly. "Because Jungkook begged us not to." She looked toward the emergency room again, feeling as though she had become a stranger in her own son's life. The painful truth wasn't that Jimin had replaced her. The truth was that Jungkook had hidden his suffering from everyone to protect them from worry, and Jimin had accepted that impossible responsibility without asking for recognition. Inside the room, Jungkook had finally fallen asleep after the medication took effect. Jimin quietly remained seated beside the bed. He watched the steady rhythm of the heart monitor while absent-mindedly holding the envelope Jungkook had given him. His fingers tightened around it every few seconds. He knew exactly what was inside besides the photograph. There were medical reports, handwritten letters, consent forms, and one sealed page that Jungkook had specifically instructed him never to open unless the worst happened. Jimin had never wanted to carry that responsibility. He had argued with Jungkook repeatedly. He had begged him to choose someone else. But Jungkook had always smiled the same quiet smile before saying, "Because you'll do what's best for me, even if it breaks your own heart." Those words still echoed inside Jimin's mind. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. The senior doctor quietly entered the room carrying another chart. He glanced toward the sleeping Jungkook before speaking in a low voice. "He's resting well now." Jimin nodded with relief. The doctor hesitated before continuing. "Mr. Park, there's something I need to ask you." Jimin looked up. "Of course." The doctor placed the chart on the table. "When was the last time you slept for more than 4 hours?" Jimin blinked in surprise. He stopped, realizing he genuinely couldn't remember. The doctor sighed. "I reviewed your examination after you collapsed." Jimin immediately looked away. "I'm fine." The doctor shook his head. "No, you're not." Jimin remained silent. "Your blood pressure is unstable. Your stress levels are dangerously high. You've lost weight since your previous medical checkup." Jimin quietly smiled. "I've just been busy." The doctor looked directly into his eyes. "You've been taking care of Jungkook for months while forgetting to take care of yourself." Jimin had no answer. The doctor slowly folded his arms. "People like you often believe they can keep giving forever." His voice softened. "But eventually, the person carrying everyone else begins to collapse too." Jimin stared at the floor. Those words struck much deeper than the doctor realized. Outside the room, RM quietly walked toward Jungkook's mother. "May I sit with you?" She nodded silently. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, she whispered, "I accused him." RM slowly looked through the glass toward Jimin. "You were scared." She shook her head. "That's not an excuse." Tears filled her eyes once again. "He never argued with me. He never defended himself." RM nodded gently. "That's who Jimin is." She wiped her tears. "How many times have I misunderstood him?" RM didn't answer because he honestly didn't know. Across the hallway, TAEHYUNG remained standing beside SUGA. "TAEHYUNG," he said quietly, "there's still something I don't understand." SUGA looked at him. If Jimin has protected Jungkook all this time, then why did Jungkook keep pushing himself until today happened? SUGA's expression grew painfully serious. Because he believed he still had time. TAEHYUNG frowned. "Time for what?" SUGA slowly looked through the emergency room window at the sleeping Jungkook. "To finish something he thought was more important than his own health." Before TAEHYUNG could ask another question, the hospital elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Everyone instinctively turned toward the sound. A middle-aged man in a dark business suit stepped out, accompanied by 2 company representatives carrying confidential folders. The moment RM recognized one of them, his expression changed completely. He quietly whispered, Why are they here? The senior representative looked around the hallway before speaking in a calm but urgent voice. We're here because there is a confidential agreement involving Jungkook that cannot remain sealed any longer. Every member immediately looked at one another in confusion. The representative slowly lifted one thick folder from his briefcase. Across the front, stamped in large red letters, were the words "strictly confidential." He looked directly at RM before quietly adding, "This document explains why Jungkook ignored every medical warning, and why Jimin spent months trying to stop him." At that moment, everyone realized the truth was no longer hiding inside the hospital room alone. It had been locked inside official documents that someone had desperately hoped would never be opened. The entire hallway fell into complete silence as the company representative carefully placed the thick confidential folder on the consultation room table. No one reached for it. No one even spoke. The bold red letters stamped across the cover seemed heavier than the folder itself. RM slowly looked from the document to the representative. "What exactly is this?" he asked in a calm voice that barely concealed his growing concern. The representative took a slow breath before answering. "This file contains internal reports, medical coordination records, schedule adjustments, and several agreements that were approved under Jungkook's direct request." Jin immediately frowned. "Medical coordination," the representative nodded. "Yes." J-Hope looked toward the emergency room where Jimin still sat beside Jungkook's bed. "Does Jimin know about this?" The representative answered without hesitation. "He was present when part of these documents were signed." Those words immediately confirmed what everyone had slowly begun to realize. Jimin had not simply been standing beside Jungkook emotionally. He had been standing beside him through every difficult decision that no one else even knew existed. Jungkook's mother quietly lowered her eyes. Every new truth made her earlier accusations feel even more painful. The representative carefully opened the folder and removed several sealed documents. "Before I continue," he said, "I need everyone here to understand something." RM nodded. "Go ahead." The representative looked around the room one person at a time. Everything inside this file remained confidential because Jungkook repeatedly refused to allow the company to suspend his activities. TAEHYUNG's breathing slowed as he listened carefully. "The doctors recommended extended recovery periods on multiple occasions," the representative continued. "Each time, Jungkook negotiated to continue working under stricter monitoring." Jin immediately asked, "Who monitored him?" The representative quietly answered, "Primarily Jimin." Once again, silence filled the hallway. SUGA closed his eyes. Nothing inside the file surprised him anymore, but hearing it spoken aloud made the burden feel real in a way it never had before. RM folded his arms. "Why Jimin?" The representative slowly removed another document from the folder. "Because Jungkook refused every other arrangement we suggested." He carefully placed the paper on the table. "Managers couldn't stay with him 24 hours a day. Medical staff couldn't travel everywhere with him. Security teams weren't medically trained." He paused before quietly adding, "Jungkook insisted there was only one person who would notice the warning signs before anyone else." Everyone already knew the answer before he spoke the name. Park Jimin. TAEHYUNG slowly leaned against the wall, overwhelmed by everything he had learned within the last hour. Memories continued replaying inside his head. Every time Jimin quietly interrupted rehearsals to hand Jungkook a bottle of water. Every time Jimin insisted on taking breaks while everyone else wanted to continue practicing. Every time Jungkook looked annoyed before secretly following Jimin's advice anyway. What had always appeared to be ordinary concern suddenly revealed itself as something much deeper. They had mistaken protection for interference. They had mistaken sacrifice for control. Inside the emergency room, Jimin remained beside Jungkook's bed, completely unaware that the truth was slowly unfolding outside. He quietly checked the blanket covering Jungkook before looking toward the sleeping younger man. His face finally showed the exhaustion he had hidden for months. The adrenaline that had carried him through the day was beginning to fade. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, he allowed himself to close his eyes for just a few seconds. The senior nurse noticed immediately. She gently approached him. "Mr. Park," she whispered, "you should rest." Jimin slowly opened his eyes and smiled politely. "I'll rest later." The nurse looked at him with quiet concern. "You've said that every time you've been here." Jimin froze. The words escaped her mouth so naturally that she immediately realized everyone outside the room had probably heard them through the partially opened door. She looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry." But it was already too late. Outside the room, TAEHYUNG stared toward the nurse in complete disbelief. "Every time," he repeated quietly. RM slowly turned toward SUGA. "How many times has he been here?" SUGA answered honestly. "More times than any of us know." Jungkook's mother slowly covered her face as fresh tears fell. She realized JIMIN had been walking these same hospital hallways countless times while carrying her son's fears alone. Meanwhile, the company representative removed another item from the confidential folder. This time it wasn't paperwork. It was a small digital voice recorder sealed inside an evidence bag. RM frowned. "What's that?" The representative looked unusually hesitant. "This contains a private recording Jungkook asked the company to keep secure." Jin looked confused. "A recording of what?" The representative answered quietly. "His personal instructions, in case he was ever unable to explain his own decisions." Every heartbeat in the room seemed to stop. TAEHYUNG looked directly at the recorder. "Does it explain everything?" The representative slowly nodded. "Almost everything." J-Hope instinctively took one step forward. "Then play it." The representative didn't move. "I can't," RM frowned. "Why not?" He carefully pointed toward the emergency room. "Because Jungkook specifically wrote that the recording must never be played unless JIMIN agrees first." Everyone instinctively looked through the glass toward JIMIN once again. Even now, after months of secrets and sacrifice, Jungkook had still entrusted the final decision to him. Jungkook's mother quietly whispered, almost to herself, "He trusted JIMIN that much." No one answered because there was nothing left to argue. The evidence spoke for itself. At that exact moment, the heart monitor inside Jungkook's room emitted a slow, steady rhythm as Jungkook gradually opened his eyes again. His first glance immediately searched the room until it found JIMIN sitting beside him. He smiled weakly before whispering, "Did they find out?" JIMIN looked toward the consultation room through the glass window, where everyone was now gathered around the confidential folder and the unopened voice recorder. He slowly looked back at Jungkook, his expression filled with both sadness and acceptance. "They're getting closer," he whispered. Jungkook quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment before taking a slow breath. "Then, it's time to stop protecting me." JIMIN immediately shook his head. "No." Jungkook looked directly into his eyes. "Promise me." JIMIN remained silent. Jungkook reached out with trembling fingers and gently placed his hand over JIMIN's. "This time," he whispered, "protect the truth instead." At that exact moment, everyone outside noticed JIMIN slowly nod for the first time that day. And although they couldn't hear a single word spoken inside the room, they all sensed that the promise JIMIN had protected for months had finally come to an end, meaning the secret powerful enough to change every relationship between them was about to be revealed. The moment JIMIN slowly nodded inside the hospital room, SUGA quietly closed his eyes as if he already knew there was no turning back. The promise that had been protecting Jungkook for months had finally reached its end. Outside the room, every member instinctively looked at one another, sensing that whatever happened next would permanently change the way they remembered the past year. No one spoke. Even the hospital staff moved more quietly than before, almost as though they understood they were standing in the middle of a life-changing moment. Inside the room, Jungkook kept his eyes fixed on JIMIN. Despite the weakness in his body, there was an unusual sense of peace on his face. It was the expression of someone who had spent too long carrying a secret alone and had finally accepted that it could no longer remain hidden. JIMIN, however, looked completely different. His shoulders felt heavier than ever. Every promise he had made, every lie he had told to protect Jungkook, every accusation he had silently accepted without defending himself suddenly came rushing back into his mind. He quietly looked down at their hands resting on the hospital blanket. "I failed," he whispered. Jungkook immediately shook his head. "No." JIMIN slowly closed his eyes. "I promised no one would ever know." Jungkook managed a faint smile despite his exhaustion. "You kept that promise longer than anyone else could have." JIMIN remained silent. The guilt inside him refused to disappear. "Because of me," he whispered again, "everyone misunderstood you." Jungkook slowly squeezed JIMIN's hand with what little strength he had left. "No," his voice became firmer. "Because of me, everyone misunderstood you." Those words broke the silence inside the room. Jimin looked away, unable to stop the tears gathering in his eyes. He had spent months convincing himself that carrying the blame was easier than breaking Jungkook's trust. But hearing Jungkook admit it aloud made the emotional weight almost unbearable. Outside the room, the company representative quietly unlocked the evidence bag containing the voice recorder. He carefully placed it on the table but still made no attempt to press play. RM looked toward him. "What are we waiting for?" the representative answered honestly. "Jimin's permission." Jin looked through the glass toward Jimin. "Should we ask him?" Before anyone moved, SUGA gently raised his hand. "Let him finish talking to Jungkook first." RM nodded. "You're right." Several minutes passed in complete silence. No one left the hallway. No one checked their phones. Even the growing crowd of reporters outside the hospital faded into the background. At that moment, nothing mattered except the conversation happening inside the emergency room. Jungkook slowly looked toward the small envelope still resting on the bedside table. "Open it." Jimin immediately looked at him. "Now," Jungkook nodded. "Before everyone comes in." Jimin hesitated for only a moment before carefully opening the envelope. Inside were several folded documents and the photograph that had slipped onto the floor earlier. This time, Jimin unfolded the photograph completely. His eyes lingered on it for several seconds. The image showed a hospital room from months earlier. Jungkook sat on the edge of a hospital bed wearing a patient bracelet. Beside him stood Jimin, also wearing a patient identification bracelet on his wrist. But what caught Jimin's attention wasn't the bracelets. It was the expression on Jungkook's face. He remembered that day perfectly. Jungkook had smiled despite receiving difficult news because he didn't want Jimin to worry. Jimin slowly turned the photograph over. Something had been written on the back in Jungkook's handwriting. He quietly read the words to himself. "If anyone ever blames you for protecting me, let this picture remind you that you were never standing beside me because you had to. You stayed because you chose to." Jimin's vision blurred instantly. A single tear landed on the handwritten message. Jungkook watched him silently before speaking again. "I wrote that after our second hospital visit." Jimin laughed weakly through his tears. "I never knew." Jungkook smiled. "I hoped you'd never need to read it." Before Jimin could respond, a gentle knock came from the door. RM carefully stepped inside after receiving permission from the doctor. He immediately noticed the emotional atmosphere in the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said quietly, "but there's something we need to ask." Jungkook nodded weakly. RM looked toward Jimin before continuing. "The company brought a voice recording. They said only you can decide whether everyone hears it." Jimin lowered his eyes. He already knew exactly which recording RM meant. Months ago, Jungkook had insisted on making it after a particularly difficult consultation with his doctors. Jimin had argued against it, believing it would never be needed. Yet somehow, Jungkook had predicted this very day. Jimin looked back toward Jungkook. "Are you sure?" Jungkook answered without hesitation. "Yes." Jimin remained silent for several more seconds before finally nodding once. "Play it." RM slowly looked toward the company representative standing outside the room. Receiving the signal, the representative carefully picked up the recorder. Every member gathered inside the consultation room. Even Jungkook's mother quietly entered, her eyes filled with both fear and regret. The representative pressed the play button. Static filled the room for only a brief second before Jungkook's recorded voice slowly emerged from the speaker. It sounded stronger than he did now, but there was obvious exhaustion beneath every word. "If you're listening to this," the recording began, then something happened that Jimin couldn't stop. Every person in the room immediately turned toward Jimin. The recording continued. "Before anyone blames him, I need all of you to know something." The room became so silent that even the faint hum of the hospital lights seemed loud. Jungkook's recorded voice took another slow breath before speaking again. "Everything Jimin did, I asked him to do." Jimin quietly lowered his head. Jungkook's mother covered her mouth as tears began falling once again. The recording continued without pause. "He argued with me more times than I can count. He wanted me to rest. He wanted me to cancel schedules. He wanted me to tell all of you the truth." Every sentence erased another misunderstanding that had existed for months. "I refused." No one moved. No one even blinked. "So if you're angry..." Jungkook's voice softened. "Be angry at me." The recording briefly fell silent before one final sentence echoed through the consultation room. "Because the person who kept saving me was never the one who needed forgiveness." Every eye slowly turned toward Jimin. But before anyone could speak, the recorder suddenly continued playing by itself, revealing that Jungkook had recorded far more than anyone realized, and the next words were about to expose a secret that even SUGA had never been told. The consultation room remained completely silent as the recorder continued playing without anyone touching it. Even the company representative looked surprised, as though he had believed the message had already ended. A soft crackle came through the speaker before Jungkook's recorded voice returned, sounding quieter than before. Almost as if he had moved farther away from the microphone. "If this part is playing," he said slowly, "then I guess nobody stopped the recording." RM instinctively looked toward the device but made no attempt to turn it off. Everyone understood that whatever came next had been intended only if the recording continued naturally. Jungkook gave a faint laugh that sounded painfully tired. "There's one more thing I never told anyone." Every heartbeat in the room seemed to slow. JIMIN remained standing near the doorway of the emergency room, his eyes fixed on the recorder. Even he looked surprised. He had never heard this part before. SUGA noticed the change in JIMIN's expression immediately. That alone confirmed this message contained something new. Jungkook continued speaking. "JIMIN thinks he was the only one protecting me." Another brief pause followed. "He's wrong." TAEHYUNG frowned slightly. Jungkook's mother slowly lowered her hands from her face, listening more carefully than ever before. The recording continued. "The truth is, I started hiding my condition because I was protecting him too." Those words instantly filled the room with confusion. RM quietly whispered, "Protecting JIMIN." Jin looked at SUGA, but even SUGA slowly shook his head. He had never heard this explanation before. Inside the emergency room, JIMIN quietly closed his eyes. "Jungkook," he whispered under his breath. The recorded voice continued. "The doctors weren't only worried about me." JIMIN's breathing suddenly became uneven. His fingers instinctively tightened around the edge of the hospital bed. Outside the room, TAEHYUNG immediately noticed the reaction. "Why is JIMIN?" Before he could finish speaking, Jungkook's recorded voice interrupted. "Months ago, after one of my appointments, the doctors asked JIMIN to stay behind after I left the room." Every person in the consultation room instinctively looked toward JIMIN again. His face had turned noticeably pale. The recording continued. "I wasn't supposed to hear what happened next." Jungkook paused for several seconds before speaking again. "But I came back because I forgot my phone." JIMIN slowly lowered his head. He remembered that day perfectly. He had believed Jungkook had already gone home. He had no idea Jungkook had returned. Jungkook's voice softened. "I heard the doctor telling JIMIN that he was showing signs of complete emotional burnout." The room became painfully quiet. J-Hope looked toward JIMIN with disbelief. Jungkook continued. "The doctor told him that if he kept ignoring his own health while taking care of me, eventually his body would collapse too." Jungkook's mother closed her eyes as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. Suddenly, the memory of JIMIN collapsing in the hallway only hours earlier became much more painful. It hadn't happened because of a single argument. It had been the result of months of emotional exhaustion. The recording continued. "JIMIN smiled at the doctor and said the same thing he always says." Jungkook paused before quietly repeating JIMIN's words. "As long as Jungkook gets better, I'll be fine." The sentence echoed through the room. No one could speak. RM slowly looked down at the floor. Jin quietly wiped away tears. Even TAEHYUNG, who had spent years beside JIMIN, realized he had never truly understood how much the older member had been sacrificing in silence. Inside the emergency room, JIMIN remained motionless. His eyes filled with tears as memories flooded back. He remembered every appointment, every warning, every promise he had made to doctors that he would take care of himself later. Later had simply never come. Jungkook's recorded voice continued. "That's when I realized." Another pause followed. "The more I depended on JIMIN, the more I was slowly hurting him." JIMIN quietly shook his head. "No," he whispered. The recording continued. "So I made another promise." RM looked toward the speaker. "I promised myself that one day I'd make him stop carrying everything alone." SUGA slowly looked away. He had known about JIMIN protecting Jungkook. He had never known Jungkook had quietly begun protecting JIMIN in return. Jungkook's voice became softer. "That's why I kept telling everyone I was fine." TAEHYUNG frowned. "What?" The recording continued. "Because if everyone believed I was getting better, maybe JIMIN would finally start taking care of himself again." JIMIN slowly covered his eyes with one trembling hand. The truth hurt far more than any accusation ever had. All this time he believed he had been protecting Jungkook alone. never realizing Jungkook had been making impossible choices for exactly the same reason. The company representative quietly looked down, allowing the recording to continue uninterrupted. Jungkook spoke again. "We were both pretending to be stronger than we really were." His voice carried a faint laugh filled with sadness. "And maybe that's where we made our biggest mistake." The room remained silent except for the recording. Then Jungkook added one final thought that completely changed the atmosphere. "If you're listening to this together," he said gently, "don't let Jimin blame himself anymore." Everyone instinctively looked toward Jimin. He could no longer hide the tears streaming down his face. Jungkook's mother slowly walked toward the emergency room door, stopping only a few steps away from him. She wanted to apologize immediately, but she could see Jimin was barely holding himself together. The recording continued once more. "Because the person who saved me the most," Jungkook paused for several long seconds, "was also the person I failed to save." The recorder finally fell silent. No one moved. No one knew what to say after hearing Jungkook's heartbreaking confession. The quiet lasted nearly a full minute before the senior doctor entered the consultation room carrying another sealed medical envelope. He looked directly at Jimin before speaking. "Mr. Park," his voice was calm, but unusually serious. "While reviewing Jungkook's previous files, we discovered something that neither of you were ever informed about." Every person in the room slowly turned toward the doctor. Even Jimin looked confused. The doctor carefully placed the unopened envelope on the table between them before quietly adding, "The results inside were never delivered because of an administrative error." He took a slow breath. "And after reading them this morning, I believe they explain why everything happened the way it did." Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the sealed medical envelope resting in the center of the table. No one dared reach for it. The room had already survived too many emotional shocks in a single day, and somehow everyone felt that whatever was inside this envelope would be different. It wouldn't simply answer questions. It would change the meaning of everything that had happened before. The senior doctor slowly looked around the room before resting his eyes on Jimin. "Mr. Park," he said quietly, "because this report involves both you and Jungkook, I believe you should decide whether it is opened now or later." Jimin stared at the envelope without moving. His mind was still overwhelmed by Jungkook's recorded confession. He had spent months believing he alone had been carrying the burden, only to discover that Jungkook had quietly been sacrificing himself for exactly the same reason. Before he could answer, Jungkook's weak voice came from inside the emergency room. "Open it." Everyone immediately turned toward the doorway. Jungkook had slowly pushed himself into a sitting position despite the doctor's earlier instructions. His face remained pale, but his eyes were completely focused on the envelope. The senior doctor approached him. "You should still be resting." Jungkook gave a faint smile. "I've rested enough." Jimin instinctively stepped closer, ready to help him sit comfortably. "Don't force yourself." Jungkook looked at him for a long moment before quietly replying, "We've spent months avoiding the truth." He slowly shifted his gaze toward the envelope. "Let's not do it anymore." The doctor carefully handed the sealed report to Jimin. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted it. The envelope felt strangely heavy, almost as though it carried the weight of every unanswered question from the past year. He slowly opened the seal while the room remained completely silent. Inside were several pages of laboratory reports, consultation notes, and one summary sheet marked with an official hospital stamp. Jimin quickly recognized the consultation date. It was from the same week as Jungkook's very first private hospital visit months earlier. His eyes moved across the report until they reached the doctor's final recommendation. Suddenly, Jimin stopped reading. His expression changed instantly. RM immediately noticed. "Jimin," he asked carefully, "what is it?" Jimin didn't answer. He simply continued staring at the paper as though unable to believe what he was reading. Jungkook quietly reached toward him. "Let me see." Jimin slowly handed him the report without saying a word. Jungkook read the first page calmly. The second page made him frown. By the third page, the color had completely drained from his face. "No," he whispered. The senior doctor looked at both of them with quiet regret. "I'm afraid it's genuine." Jungkook slowly looked up. "Why were we never told?" The doctor sighed deeply. The report was completed during a transfer between hospital systems. He pointed toward the administrative stamp. "It was mistakenly archived instead of being delivered to your attending physician." RM took one careful step closer. "Can someone please explain what's happening?" The senior doctor nodded. "The medical team based Jungkook's treatment plan on incomplete information." The room immediately fell silent again. TAEHYUNG frowned. Incomplete. The doctor nodded once. One important test result was missing. J-Hope looked stunned. For months. Yes, the doctor lowered his eyes. Unfortunately. Jungkook continued reading the report while Jimin watched him anxiously. Finally, Jungkook quietly placed the papers back on the table. So, he whispered, it wasn't getting worse as quickly as everyone thought. The doctor shook his head gently. According to these results, your condition at that time was responding better than expected. Jin blinked in surprise. Wait, he looked toward the doctor. Are you saying? The doctor finished the sentence for him. The treatment had been more effective than anyone realized. Complete silence followed. Jimin stared at the report again, struggling to process what those words meant. Months of fear, months of impossible decisions, months of emotional exhaustion, all while an important piece of medical information had remained hidden because of a simple administrative mistake. Jungkook slowly laughed, but there was no happiness in it. We lost all that time, he whispered, believing the worst. Jimin quietly looked down. He remembered every sleepless night, every desperate conversation with doctors, every argument with Jungkook about slowing down, every moment he believed he was watching his friend grow weaker. The possibility that they had been carrying unnecessary fear made his chest tighten. The senior doctor spoke carefully. Please don't misunderstand. Everyone looked toward him. Jungkook was still genuinely unwell. He paused before continuing. The missing report didn't erase the seriousness of his condition. RM nodded slowly, but it changed the outlook. Exactly. The doctor folded his hands. It suggested there was significantly more hope than the original team believed. Jungkook slowly looked toward Jimin. You spent months preparing for the worst. Jimin quietly nodded. Because that's what we were told. Jungkook closed his eyes. I'm sorry. Jimin immediately shook his head. None of this is your fault. Before anyone could continue, another doctor hurried into the consultation room carrying a tablet. His expression immediately caught everyone's attention. Doctor, he said urgently to the senior physician, the additional imaging results just arrived. The senior doctor accepted the tablet and carefully reviewed the new scans. His expression slowly changed from concern to confusion. That's impossible, he whispered. RM stepped forward. What happened? The senior doctor zoomed in on the images several times before slowly looking toward Jungkook. Your latest results don't match the progression we expected. Jungkook frowned. Is that good? The doctor hesitated before answering. I don't know yet. The room immediately became tense once again. He continued studying the scans while comparing them with the newly discovered archived report. Several long moments passed before he finally looked back at everyone. I need to consult with another specialist immediately. Jimin's heartbeat quickened. Why? The doctor slowly placed the tablet on the table. Because these new findings suggest we may have misunderstood something fundamental about Jungkook's condition from the very beginning. Every member looked at one another in complete confusion. SUGA quietly narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? The doctor took a slow breath before answering. I'm beginning to question whether we've been treating the correct problem at all. Those words froze the entire room. After months of sacrifice, hidden pain, broken promises, and endless fear, the possibility that everyone had been fighting the wrong battle left them completely speechless. While the specialist the senior doctor had urgently requested was already on his way to the hospital carrying information that could overturn every conclusion they had believed until now. The consultation room fell into absolute silence after the senior doctor's shocking statement. No one could process what they had just heard. RM slowly looked toward the medical scans on the tablet before turning back to the doctor. Are you saying the diagnosis was wrong? He asked carefully. The senior doctor immediately shook his head. No. He paused for a moment, choosing his words with extreme caution. I'm saying the full picture may have been incomplete. Jin folded his arms, trying to remain calm despite the growing confusion. What's the difference? The doctor took a slow breath. A diagnosis can be correct while the underlying cause is misunderstood. J-Hope quietly rubbed the back of his neck. So we've been treating the symptoms. The doctor nodded, without fully understanding why they continued appearing. Everyone exchanged uneasy glances. The explanation answered almost nothing, yet somehow made the situation feel even more complicated. Inside the emergency room, Jungkook leaned back against the pillow as fatigue slowly returned. Even listening to the conversation outside had drained what little strength he had regained. Jimin immediately noticed and gently adjusted the pillow behind him. "You don't have to stay awake," Jimin said softly. Jungkook smiled weakly. "I do." Jimin quietly shook his head. "You've done enough today." Jungkook looked directly into his eyes. "Not until this is over." Before Jimin could reply, the emergency room door opened again. The senior doctor stepped inside carrying the tablet and quietly sat beside Jungkook's bed. "There's something I'd like to ask both of you." Jimin and Jungkook immediately looked toward him. "Think carefully," the doctor continued. "Several months ago, before Jungkook's first hospitalization, did anything significant change?" Jungkook frowned slightly. "Change," the doctor nodded. "Anything at all, your routine, your work schedule, your sleep. Your travel, anything unusual." Jungkook remained silent while searching his memory. Jimin did the same. For several long moments, neither of them answered. Then Jimin suddenly looked up. "The overseas tour." Jungkook immediately turned toward him. "You're right." The doctor leaned forward. "Tell me about it." Jimin took a slow breath. "Everything became much more intense after that tour. The rehearsals got longer. We barely slept. There were constant flights between countries. We kept adjusting to different time zones without enough recovery." Jungkook quietly nodded. "I remember feeling exhausted almost every day." The doctor carefully listened without interrupting. Jimin continued. "At first we thought it was just normal fatigue." Jungkook added, "Then the dizziness started." The doctor looked thoughtful. "And that's when you came to the hospital." "Yes," Jungkook answered. The senior doctor quietly opened another file on the tablet. "Interesting." RM stepped into the room after receiving permission. "Did you find something?" The doctor slowly turned the screen toward everyone. "I've been comparing the timeline of Jungkook's symptoms with every medical record we have." TAEHYUNG, SUGA, Jin, J-Hope, and Jungkook's mother quietly gathered around the screen. The doctor pointed toward several dates highlighted in blue. "Notice something." RM carefully studied the timeline. "The severe episodes happened after periods of almost no rest." "Exactly." Doctor tapped another section of the report, and each recovery period began improving only after several days away from intense schedules. Taehyung slowly frowned. "So the pressure made everything worse." "It appears so." The doctor nodded. "But that's not the surprising part." He enlarged another section of the report. "Look here." Everyone leaned closer. "These measurements improved far more rapidly than expected each time he was allowed to recover properly." Jungkook quietly looked at Jimin. "You kept telling me to slow down." Jimin gave a sad smile. "You never listened." Jungkook laughed weakly despite himself. "I know." The senior doctor looked at both of them. "Mr. Jian," his tone became serious again. "Do you remember why you insisted on returning to work early every single time?" Jungkook hesitated. Everyone waited. Finally, he answered honestly. "Because I thought if I stopped." He looked toward his members one by one. "I'd become a burden." Complete silence filled the room again. Jin immediately shook his head. "You were never a burden." RM quietly nodded in agreement. "Not once." J-Hope looked at Jungkook with obvious emotion. "Why didn't you tell us?" Jungkook slowly lowered his eyes. "Because I was afraid everyone would start worrying more about me than about our work." Taehyung stepped closer. "We're your family." Jungkook smiled sadly. "That's exactly why I couldn't." Jimin quietly looked away. Hearing Jungkook finally say those words aloud explained so many conversations they had shared in private. Every time Jimin begged him to rest, Jungkook had always answered with the same fear. He never wanted the people he loved to carry his burden. SUGA slowly crossed his arms before speaking for the first time in several minutes. "You know." Everyone turned toward him. "You and Jimin made exactly the same mistake." Jungkook looked confused. SUGA continued. "Both of you decided to protect everyone by carrying everything yourselves." No one argued because everyone knew he was right. Jimin protected Jungkook by hiding the truth. Jungkook protected Jimin by hiding his own fear. Both believed silence was kindness. Both nearly destroyed themselves because of it. The senior doctor quietly watched the exchange before speaking again. "Sometimes," he looked around the room, "the greatest danger isn't illness." Everyone listened carefully. "Sometimes it's believing you have to face it alone." Those words settled deeply into everyone's heart. Even Jungkook's mother quietly wiped away another tear. She finally understood that this tragedy had not been caused by one mistake or one person. It had grown from months of silence shared by people who loved each other too much to admit they needed help. Just as the emotional atmosphere in the room began softening for the first time all day, the consultation room telephone suddenly rang. The sharp sound startled everyone. One of the nurses answered immediately before looking toward the senior doctor with visible surprise. "Doctor," she said quietly, "the specialist from the National Medical Center has arrived." The senior doctor immediately stood. "Already?" The nurse nodded. "Yes," she hesitated before adding one final sentence. "He says he personally reviewed Jungkook's complete history during the drive here." Everyone instinctively looked toward the doorway as slow footsteps approached from the corridor. The specialist entered carrying a thick leather case filled with medical files. His expression was calm, but unusually serious. He greeted everyone politely before placing a single folder on the table. Across the cover, in bold black letters, was written "Final Clinical Review." He slowly looked directly at Jungkook, then at Jimin, before speaking words that instantly erased every assumption made throughout the day. "After reviewing every report from the beginning," he said quietly, "I don't believe the biggest secret in this hospital is Jungkook's condition." The room became completely silent. The specialist slowly turned toward Jimin, his expression filled with concern. "I believe the person all of you should be examining is the one who collapsed in the hallway." No one breathed. No one moved. Because in that single moment, the focus of the entire story shifted away from Jungkook and toward the heartbreaking truth that Jimin had been hiding from everyone, including Jungkook himself. The specialist's final sentence hung in the air like a thunderclap. Every person in the room instinctively turned toward Jimin. Even Jimin himself looked completely confused. "Me?" he asked quietly, almost unable to believe what he had heard. The specialist gave a slow nod before opening the leather case and carefully placing several medical documents on the table. "Please don't misunderstand," he said calmly. "I'm not saying Mr. Park has the same condition as Jungkook. What concerns me is something entirely different." RM immediately stepped forward. "Then explain it to us." The specialist adjusted his glasses before looking directly at Jimin. "Mr. Park, over the last several months, how many medical appointments have you attended for yourself?" Jimin hesitated. His silence answered the question before he even spoke. "I don't remember." The specialist gently folded his hands together. "That's exactly what worries me." Jungkook slowly looked toward Jimin. "You told me you were fine." Jimin forced a small smile. "I thought I was." The specialist quietly shook his head. "Thinking you're fine and actually being fine are not always the same thing." The room fell silent once again. Jin slowly sat down in the nearest chair, unable to hide the concern on his face. J-Hope stared at Jimin with disbelief, replaying countless moments from the past year. He remembered Jimin skipping meals during rehearsals. He remembered him staying behind after everyone else had gone home. He remembered the dark circles under Jimin's eyes that everyone had blamed on busy schedules. None of them had questioned it because Jimin always smiled and said he was simply tired. The specialist continued. "I reviewed the report from the examination performed after Mr. Park collapsed earlier today." He looked toward the senior doctor. "Your team documented severe physical exhaustion, prolonged sleep deprivation, elevated stress markers, dehydration, and signs consistent with chronic emotional overload." Jungkook slowly lowered his head. Every word felt like another weight pressing against his chest. The specialist spoke gently rather than dramatically. "Those findings don't appear overnight. They usually develop over a long period when someone continuously ignores their own limits." SUGA quietly closed his eyes. "I told him to slow down," he whispered, "more than once." TAEHYUNG looked at SUGA. "Why didn't he listen?" SUGA answered with a sad smile. "Because every time he had a choice between taking care of himself and taking care of Jungkook." He slowly looked toward Jimin. "He always chose Jungkook." Jimin immediately shook his head. "It wasn't like that." SUGA calmly met his eyes. "Then tell us the truth." Jimin remained silent. For the first time all day, he couldn't find the words to protect anyone. Jungkook quietly reached for his hand again. "Please," he whispered, "no more hiding." Jimin looked down at their hands before finally taking a slow breath. "I wasn't trying to be a hero." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I was just afraid." RM looked at him carefully. "Afraid of what?" Jimin answered honestly. "Every time I saw him smile in front of everyone." He glanced toward Jungkook. "I knew how much pain he had hidden before walking onto that stage." The room remained completely silent. "If I became exhausted too," Jimin continued, "then who would notice when he wasn't okay?" Jungkook closed his eyes as tears slowly formed beneath his lashes. Jimin laughed quietly, but there was no joy in the sound. "So I kept telling myself I'd rest tomorrow." He slowly shook his head. Then tomorrow became next week, and next week became months. Jungkook whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" Jimin looked directly at him. "Because you already had enough to worry about." Those words hit Jungkook harder than anything he had heard all day. They reflected his own thinking so perfectly that he finally understood what SUGA had meant. They had both been trapped in the same cycle, each trying to protect the other through silence. The specialist allowed the room to remain quiet before speaking again. "This isn't about assigning blame." Everyone looked toward him. "It's about recognizing a pattern." He pointed gently toward Jimin and Jungkook. One person ignored his health because he didn't want to worry the people he loved. Then he pointed toward Jimin. The other ignored his health because he wanted to care for that person. He slowly lowered his hand. Different reasons, the same result. No one disagreed. Jungkook's mother slowly walked toward Jimin with tears still visible in her eyes. She stopped only a short distance away. "Jimin!" Her voice trembled. "I owe you an apology." Jimin immediately shook his head. "You don't have to, please," she interrupted softly. "Let me say it." The room remained perfectly still as she continued. "I judged you without knowing the truth. I believed fear instead of asking questions, and I said things that must have hurt you deeply." Her voice cracked. "I'm truly sorry." Jimin stood quietly for several seconds before giving her a gentle nod. "I understand why you were scared." She wiped away another tear. "Thank you." Jungkook watched the exchange in silence, relief slowly replacing the guilt that had filled his expression since waking up. For the first time that day, one misunderstanding had finally come to an end. But as the specialist quietly organized the remaining reports inside his leather case, his expression remained thoughtful rather than relieved. RM noticed immediately. "Doctor," he asked carefully, "is something still bothering you?" The specialist looked toward the folder he had not yet opened. "Yes." Everyone instinctively turned toward him again. He rested one hand on the unopened file before speaking in a calm voice. "Everything we've discussed today explains what happened inside this hospital." He paused briefly. "But it still doesn't explain one important question." TAEHYUNG frowned. "Which question?" The specialist slowly looked around the room. "What happened on the day Jungkook collapsed that caused his condition to deteriorate so suddenly?" The room fell silent once more. Because despite every confession, every apology, and every hidden truth that had finally been revealed, the event that had started this entire nightmare remained unanswered. And someone inside the hospital already knew exactly what had happened, but had chosen not to tell anyone. The specialist's question lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. Every person present instinctively replayed the events of that morning in their minds, searching for something they might have overlooked. RM was the first to break the silence. "He's right," he said quietly. "We've learned why everyone kept secrets, but we still don't know what actually happened before Jungkook was brought here." Jin slowly nodded. Everything changed so fast. J-Hope folded his arms, remembering the panic that had spread through the building. One moment everyone thought it was another normal schedule, and the next moment Jungkook was unconscious. TAEHYUNG looked toward Jimin. "You were the last person with him before the ambulance arrived." Jimin lowered his eyes. "Yes." The room immediately became quiet again. Jungkook slowly turned his head toward Jimin. His expression remained gentle, without a trace of blame. "You don't have to protect me anymore," he whispered. "Tell them everything." Jimin closed his eyes for a few seconds. He had known this moment would eventually come, yet standing in front of everyone made it feel far more difficult than he had imagined. After taking a slow breath, he finally began speaking. This morning started like every other schedule. Everyone listened carefully. Jungkook arrived earlier than usual. Jungkook quietly nodded, confirming the memory. He looked tired, but he smiled and insisted he had slept well. Jimin looked at him before continuing. "I knew he was lying." A faint, embarrassed smile crossed Jungkook's face. "You always knew." Jimin gave a small nod. "Because I could see it in your eyes." The room remained silent. Before rehearsals started, Jimin continued. "I asked him to sit down for a few minutes." RM listened closely. "Did he?" Jimin slowly shook his head. "No," Jungkook quietly sighed. "I told him we didn't have time." Jimin continued the story without emotion, simply describing what had happened. "I checked his pulse while pretending to adjust his microphone." TAEHYUNG looked surprised. "You did that?" Jimin nodded. His heartbeat was already faster than normal. The specialist immediately looked interested. "And what did you do?" "I asked him to cancel the rehearsal." The room became silent again. Jungkook quietly smiled to himself. "I refused." Jimin looked down. "Like always." Suga slowly crossed his arms. Every word matched what he had witnessed for months. Jimin continued. We argued. Jungkook immediately corrected him. It wasn't really an argument. Jimin gave him a tired smile. For us, it was. A few members almost smiled for the first time that day, recognizing how familiar that exchange sounded. But the smile quickly disappeared as Jimin continued. I told him that if he walked onto that stage, I'd call the doctors myself. Jungkook looked away, and I told him not to. RM frowned. Why? Jungkook answered honestly. Because I thought I could finish just one more rehearsal. Jimin quietly added, he promised he'd stop the moment he felt dizzy. Jungkook slowly nodded. I meant it. Jimin's voice became softer. The problem was, he paused briefly. By the time he admitted he was dizzy, he was already collapsing. Complete silence filled the room. Every member could now picture the scene, the rehearsal hall. The bright lights, Jungkook pushing himself one last time despite Jimin's repeated warnings. The specialist quietly wrote several notes before asking another question. When he collapsed, what did you do first? Jimin answered immediately, as though the memory had been permanently carved into his mind. I caught him before he hit the floor. Jungkook looked toward him. You did, Jimin continued. I called emergency services while checking his breathing. The senior doctor quietly nodded. The ambulance report confirms that. Jimin swallowed before continuing. When the paramedics arrived, his voice became noticeably quieter. They asked who knew his medical history. Everyone looked at him. I said I did. Jungkook's mother slowly lowered her head. She remembered arriving at the hospital only after the ambulance had already left. She had never seen the first moments of the emergency. Jimin continued speaking. The paramedics asked me to ride with him. TAEHYUNG frowned. You never told us that. Jimin quietly smiled without humor. There wasn't time, he continued. During the ambulance ride, his breathing slowed. Jungkook briefly opened his eyes. Jungkook looked at him silently. Jimin smiled sadly. The first thing he asked wasn't whether he was okay. The room waited. He asked if the rehearsal had been canceled. Even the specialist looked surprised. Jungkook laughed weakly. That sounds like me. Jimin nodded. I told him not to talk. Jungkook quietly whispered, and I ignored you again. Jimin couldn't help giving a faint smile despite everything, but it disappeared almost immediately. Then, he looked down at his hands. He grabbed my wrist. Everyone leaned forward slightly. He made me promise that if anything happened at the hospital, Jimin slowly closed his eyes. I wouldn't tell anyone about the months of treatment. Jungkook quietly nodded. That's true. RM slowly exhaled. So even inside the ambulance. Jimin answered. He was still trying to protect everyone. The room remained silent. The specialist finished another note before asking one final question. Mr. Park, Jimin looked up. During the ambulance ride, did Jungkook say anything else? Jimin hesitated. His expression changed slightly. Jungkook noticed immediately. Jimin looked at him with visible uncertainty. There was one sentence. Jungkook frowned. What sentence? Jimin remained silent for several long seconds before finally answering. You asked me. His voice almost disappeared into a whisper. Whether I had received the message. Jungkook's eyes instantly widened. The message? RM looked confused. What message? Jimin slowly shook his head. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. Jungkook's breathing suddenly became uneven. No, he whispered. That's impossible. The specialist immediately looked toward him. Mr. Jian. Jungkook slowly sat upright despite the doctor's attempt to stop him. His face had turned completely pale. I sent Jimin a message before rehearsal started. Everyone stared at him. Jimin looked equally confused. I never got anything. Jungkook immediately looked toward RM. Check my phone. RM quickly retrieved Jungkook's phone from the bedside table. The device was still powered on. He opened the messaging application under Jungkook's guidance. The sent message was there, time-stamped only minutes before the collapse, but beside it appeared a small red notification that instantly caught everyone's attention. Message not delivered. The room became silent once again. Jungkook slowly whispered if Jimin never received it. He looked directly at Jimin. Then everything that happened afterward makes sense. RM frowned. What was in the message? Jungkook closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. It was the first time. He slowly looked around the room. I finally agreed to cancel everything and tell the members the truth. Every person froze, because a single undelivered message had changed the course of the entire day, and someone now had to answer the most disturbing question of all. Why had that message never reached Jimin when it mattered the most? A heavy silence settled over the hospital room after RM stared at the words message not delivered on Jungkook's phone. No one spoke. No one even reached for the device. The small red notification suddenly felt more important than every confidential document, every medical report, and every hidden promise they had uncovered that day. RM slowly looked up from the screen. "Are you absolutely certain this is the message?" Jungkook nodded without hesitation. "Yes." His voice remained weak but steady. "I typed it before rehearsals started." RM carefully opened the unsent message while everyone gathered around him. The room became so quiet that the sound of the phone unlocking seemed unusually loud. He silently read the first line before stopping. His expression immediately changed. Jin noticed first. "What is it?" RM looked toward Jungkook. "Do you want me to read it?" Jungkook slowly closed his eyes for a moment before nodding. "Everyone deserves to hear it." RM took a slow breath and began reading aloud. "Jimin, you were right. I'm done pretending I'm okay. After rehearsal, let's cancel everything. We'll tell the members together. No more hiding. No more promises that only hurt both of us. This time, I want all of us to carry this together." The room immediately fell silent again. Jimin slowly lowered his head as tears filled his eyes. If that message had arrived only a few minutes earlier, everything might have unfolded differently. Jungkook continued listening while RM quietly read the rest. "And one more thing. After this is over, you're going to let the doctors take care of you too." "That's not a request, that's my decision." Jimin covered his mouth with one trembling hand. He had never seen those words before. Jungkook smiled sadly. "I finally listened to you." Jimin looked at him with tears streaming freely down his face. "You did," his voice cracked, "but I never knew." SUGA slowly looked toward the floor. The tragedy suddenly became even more painful. It wasn't stubbornness that had kept the truth hidden that morning. Jungkook had already decided to tell everyone. Fate had simply placed one invisible obstacle between his decision and the person who needed to hear it most. The specialist quietly folded his arms. "Can we determine why the message failed?" RM immediately handed the phone to the company technician who had accompanied the representatives earlier. The technician carefully examined the device before checking the message details. Several tense seconds passed. "I found something," he said. Everyone immediately looked toward him. The message wasn't blocked. Continued checking the system logs. It wasn't deleted either. TAEHYUNG frowned. "Then what happened?" The technician enlarged another screen. "There was no network connection at the exact moment the message was sent." J-Hope looked confused. "Just bad signal." The technician nodded. "The phone attempted to send it several times." He pointed toward the timestamps. "Each attempt failed because the connection dropped." RM quietly exhaled. "So nobody caused it?" "No," the technician answered honestly. "It appears to have been an unfortunate technical failure." No one spoke after hearing those words. There was no villain, no conspiracy, no betrayal, just one failed message that arrived too late to change the course of the day. Jungkook slowly leaned back against the pillow, closing his eyes. "I kept thinking," he whispered, "that Jimin ignored what I wrote." Jimin immediately shook his head. "I would never ignore you." Jungkook smiled faintly. "I know that now." The specialist quietly observed both of them before speaking again. "Sometimes people spend years searching for someone to blame." Everyone looked toward him. "But the hardest truth is accepting that not every tragedy is caused by one person." RM slowly nodded. "Sometimes," the specialist finished his thought, "it's a series of small decisions and unfortunate moments that finally collide." Jungkook's mother slowly approached Jimin once more. This time she didn't hesitate. She gently held both of his hands. "Thank you," she whispered through tears. Jimin looked surprised. She smiled sadly. "Not just for today," her voice trembled. "Thank you for every day I never saw." Jimin couldn't answer immediately. The emotion in her words overwhelmed him. After several long seconds, he quietly replied, "I only wanted him to smile again." She gently squeezed his hands. "You gave my son far more than that." Across the room, TAEHYUNG slowly walked toward Jungkook's bedside. "Can I ask you something?" Jungkook nodded. "Anything." TAEHYUNG smiled sadly. "Next time." He paused. "If you're scared." Jungkook looked at him. "Will you tell us?" Jungkook's eyes slowly moved around the room. RM, Jin, SUGA, J-Hope, TAEHYUNG, his mother, finally Jimin. He quietly smiled. "Yes." Jimin immediately added, "and next time." Everyone turned toward him. He looked directly at Jungkook before continuing. "If I stop taking care of myself." Jungkook smiled through tired eyes. "I'll drag you to the hospital myself." A quiet laugh spread through the room for the first time that entire day. It was small, emotional, and mixed with tears, but it reminded everyone what hope sounded like. Even the specialist smiled faintly before gathering his files. "I believe my work here is almost finished." As he organized the final documents inside his leather case, one thin folder accidentally slipped onto the floor. RM instinctively bent down to pick it up. Before handing it back, his eyes landed on the title printed across the front page. It wasn't a medical report. It wasn't a hospital document. It was an internal psychological evaluation requested months earlier for one specific reason. Across the top of the file was written, "Confidential recommendation, immediate counseling for primary caregiver." Beneath the title, only one name appeared, Park Jimin. RM slowly looked toward the specialist. Why was this never discussed? The specialist's expression immediately changed. He accepted the folder slowly before answering in a quiet voice. "Because Mr. Park refused the recommendation." Jimin lowered his head. "I didn't have time." The specialist gently corrected him. "No." Everyone looked toward him. "You believed you didn't deserve to make time." The room fell silent once again, because for the first time, they realized Jimin's greatest struggle had never been taking care of Jungkook. It had been believing that his own well-being mattered just as much as the person he had devoted himself to protecting. The words, "You believed you didn't deserve to make time," remained in the room long after the specialist finished speaking. No one responded immediately because everyone understood that he had identified something much deeper than physical exhaustion. Jimin quietly lowered his eyes to the floor. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to insist that he had simply been busy. But for the first time in months, he realized he no longer had the strength to pretend. Jungkook watched him in silence before slowly speaking. "Is that really how you felt?" Jimin didn't answer. The silence itself became the answer. Jungkook slowly reached out again, gently touching Jimin's wrist. "Look at me." Jimin hesitated before lifting his eyes. Jungkook smiled sadly. "When was the last time you asked yourself if you were okay?" Jimin searched for an answer, but nothing came to mind. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks disappeared into months. Every morning had begun with checking Jungkook's condition. Every evening had ended with reviewing medications, schedules, or messages from doctors. Somewhere along the way, he had completely stopped asking himself the same question he asked Jungkook every single day. "Are you okay?" The realization hit him harder than he expected. He quietly laughed once, but it sounded empty. "I don't remember." Jungkook slowly nodded. "That's what I was afraid of." RM quietly looked toward the specialist. "Is this common?" The specialist answered calmly. "Much more common than people realize." Everyone listened carefully. People who dedicate themselves entirely to caring for someone else often convince themselves that their own exhaustion can wait. He looked toward Jimin. "Eventually, waiting becomes living." Jin quietly rubbed his eyes. "He carried this alone for months." Suga slowly corrected him. "Longer than that." Everyone looked at Suga. He remained silent for several seconds before continuing. Even before Jungkook's first hospital visit. He looked toward Jimin with a faint, bittersweet smile. He was already the first person to notice when something wasn't right. TAEHYUNG quietly frowned. "You mean before anyone else?" Suga nodded. "Before the doctors, before the managers, before us." J-Hope looked surprised. "How?" Suga smiled faintly. "Because Jimin always notices the little things everyone else overlooks." He quietly looked toward Jungkook. He noticed when Jungkook stopped finishing his meals. Jungkook lowered his head. "I thought nobody saw." Suga continued. "He noticed when your energy disappeared after rehearsals even though you kept smiling." RM slowly remembered countless small moments that suddenly made sense. Jimin quietly encouraging Jungkook to sit down between practice sessions. Jimin insisting on taking short breaks while everyone else wanted to continue. Jimin constantly carrying water bottles without anyone asking. At the time, everyone had laughed and called him overprotective. None of them realized he had been responding to warning signs they couldn't yet see. Jungkook slowly smiled through tired eyes. "You noticed before I even admitted it to myself." Jimin quietly looked away. "Because I know you too well." The room fell silent once again. Jungkook's mother stepped closer, her voice gentle. "And who was watching over you?" Jimin looked surprised by the question. He instinctively searched for an answer but found none. The specialist quietly answered instead. "No one." Those two words landed heavily on everyone's heart. Suga slowly exhaled. "We all assumed he was fine because he always smiled." TAEHYUNG looked down with visible regret. "We never asked twice." RM nodded quietly. We should have. Jimin immediately shook his head. Please don't blame yourselves. Everyone looked toward him. I never told any of you the truth. Jungkook smiled weakly. Just like me. Their eyes met once again. This time there was no guilt between them, only understanding. They had both made the same mistake for the same reason. They loved the people around them so deeply that they believed silence was the kindest choice. The specialist slowly closed the final medical file. I have one recommendation. RM nodded respectfully. Please. The specialist looked directly at Jungkook and Jimin before speaking. Neither of you should make another promise about protecting each other. Both of them looked confused. The specialist smiled gently. Instead, he slowly looked around the room. Make one promise to everyone standing here. RM, Jin, SUGA, J-Hope, TAEHYUNG, and Jungkook's mother listened carefully. The next time either of you is struggling, he paused briefly, you won't carry it alone. Silence filled the room. Then Jungkook slowly looked toward Jimin. Can you promise that? Jimin smiled faintly. Only if you promise too. Jungkook laughed quietly. Deal. They gently shook hands, not as two people making another secret promise, but as two friends finally agreeing to stop hiding from the people who cared about them. For the first time that entire day, the atmosphere inside the hospital began to feel lighter. Even the nurses passing through the hallway noticed the tension slowly disappearing. The senior doctor quietly reviewed Jungkook's latest monitor readings before smiling. Your heart rate has finally returned to normal. Jungkook looked toward Jimin with a playful expression despite his exhaustion. See, Jimin folded his arms. Don't get too confident. A few soft laughs filled the room again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was simply the sound of people finally breathing after holding their fear inside for far too long. Just as everyone began believing the worst was finally behind them, one of the hospital administrators hurried into the consultation room carrying a sealed package that had just been delivered from the front reception. Excuse me, she said politely. This was addressed specifically to Mr. Park Jimin. Jimin looked surprised. To me, she nodded and handed him the unopened package. There was no sender's name, no return address, only Jimin's full name written neatly across the front. RM frowned slightly. Were you expecting something? Jimin slowly shook his head. No. Curious, everyone watched as he carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter and an old USB drive. Jimin unfolded the letter first. The moment his eyes reached the signature at the bottom, every trace of color disappeared from his face. His hands began trembling so violently that the paper almost slipped from his fingers. Jungkook immediately noticed. Jimin. His voice became serious. Who sent it? Jimin stared at the signature for several long seconds before finally whispering words that instantly froze every person in the room. This, he struggled to breathe, was written by someone we all believed disappeared from our lives years ago. Before anyone could ask another question, the USB drive slipped from the envelope and landed on the table. Attached to it was a small handwritten label containing only 7 words. The truth begins with the video inside. The room fell into complete silence once again, because everyone realized that everything they had uncovered inside the hospital might have been only the beginning of a much larger secret that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The USB drive remained untouched in the middle of the consultation room as though no one wanted to be responsible for revealing whatever had been hidden inside it. Every pair of eyes moved from the small handwritten label to Jimin's pale face. His breathing had become noticeably uneven, and for the first time since Jungkook regained consciousness, genuine fear appeared in his expression. Jungkook slowly reached toward him. Jimin, he said quietly. Who wrote the letter? Jimin looked at the folded page still trembling in his hands. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. RM gently stepped closer. You don't have to answer immediately. Jimin slowly shook his head. No, he swallowed with difficulty. If I'm going to stop hiding things. He looked toward everyone in the room. Then I have to tell the truth. The atmosphere immediately became tense again. Even the specialist remained where he stood, sensing that this conversation had suddenly become far more than a medical discussion. Jimin carefully unfolded the handwritten letter once more. The paper was slightly worn, as if it had been written long before it was finally delivered. He quietly read the first line to himself before taking a slow breath. The signature, he whispered, belongs to someone who used to work very closely with us years ago. TAEHYUNG frowned. Someone from the company. Jimin nodded slowly. Yes. Jin looked surprised. Why would someone from years ago send you something now? Jimin lowered his eyes again. Because, he hesitated. He knew about the first time Jungkook collapsed. Complete silence filled the room. Jungkook immediately looked toward him. The first time, Jimin nodded. Not the first hospital visit. His voice became quieter. The first collapse that nobody except 2 people ever knew happened. Every member stared at him in disbelief. RM slowly spoke. There was another collapse, Jimin answered honestly. Yes. Suga quietly closed his eyes. He immediately understood why Jimin looked so shaken. When? Jimin looked toward the window, his mind drifting back several years. It happened after a late-night rehearsal. Jungkook remained completely silent. His expression suggested that even he had almost forgotten about that night. Jimin continued. Everyone else had already gone home. He paused briefly. Only Jungkook and I stayed behind because he wanted to practice one last performance. Jungkook gave a weak, embarrassed smile. I remember, Jimin nodded. He kept saying one more run. TAEHYUNG quietly sighed. That sounds exactly like him. Jimin smiled sadly before continuing. After about 20 minutes, his voice softened. He suddenly lost his balance. The room remained completely silent. He didn't completely lose consciousness. Jimin looked toward Jungkook. But he couldn't stand. Jungkook slowly nodded. You caught me. Jimin smiled faintly. Again. RM folded his arms. Why didn't you tell anyone? Jimin answered immediately. Because Jungkook begged me not to. Jungkook quietly lowered his head. I told him it was only exhaustion. Jimin looked directly at him. And I believed you because I wanted to. The specialist listened carefully without interrupting. Jimin continued. The next morning, he held up the handwritten letter. Someone approached me privately. Everyone looked at the letter. He said he had seen what happened through the rehearsal room security monitor. Jin looked surprised. There were cameras. RM quietly nodded. Most rehearsal rooms have internal security recording. Jimin continued. He promised he wouldn't report it to anyone. TAEHYUNG frowned. Why? Jimin quietly answered. Because he believed we deserved one chance to handle it ourselves. Jungkook slowly closed his eyes. I remember talking to him. Jimin nodded. He told both of us something I'll never forget. He unfolded another section of the letter and quietly read it aloud. The strongest people are usually the last ones to admit they need help. Don't wait until your silence becomes someone else's regret. The room became silent once again. Suga slowly looked toward the floor. He was right. Jimin gave a small nod. At the time, I thought we still had plenty of time. Jungkook whispered. So did I, the specialist gently asked. What happened to him afterward? Jimin looked at the signature once more. He resigned from the company a few months later. RM frowned. Without telling anyone, Jimin nodded. He left quietly. Jungkook slowly added. We never heard from him again. Everyone looked at the mysterious letter resting in Jimin's hands. After years of complete silence, it had suddenly arrived on the very day everything finally came crashing down. J-Hope quietly looked toward the unopened USB drive. If that's the letter, he hesitated. Then what's on the video? Jimin slowly picked up the USB drive without answering. His hands still trembled. The specialist looked toward the hospital administrator. Is there a computer available? She immediately nodded. There's one in the conference room. RM carefully looked at Jimin. You don't have to watch it now if you're not ready. Jimin remained silent for several long seconds before finally shaking his head. No, he looked toward Jungkook. We've spent too many years waiting. Jungkook quietly smiled despite his fatigue. Then let's face it together. Everyone slowly followed the hospital administrator into the nearby conference room where a monitor had already been prepared. The USB drive rested in Jimin's hand the entire walk. It felt strangely familiar, almost as though it had been waiting all these years for this exact moment. Inside the conference room, the lights were dimmed as the technician connected the USB drive to the computer. A single video file immediately appeared on the screen. There was no title, no date, only a file name consisting of one word, remember. The technician looked toward Jimin. Should I play it? Jimin slowly looked around the room. Jungkook nodded. RM nodded. Jin, Suga, J-Hope, TAEHYUNG, and Jungkook's mother silently agreed as well. Taking one final breath, Jimin quietly answered, Play it. The screen faded from black, and within seconds an old rehearsal room recording appeared. At first, everything looked completely ordinary. Jungkook was practicing choreography while Jimin watched from the side with a bottle of water in his hand. Then the timestamp advanced several minutes, and the atmosphere changed. Jungkook suddenly stumbled exactly as Jimin had described. Jimin rushed forward and caught him before he could hit the floor. The room watched in complete silence. But just as everyone believed they were seeing the incident Jimin had already explained, the camera angle shifted to another security feed, revealing someone else standing quietly outside the rehearsal room door, someone none of them had expected to see. And the moment his face became visible on the monitor, every person in the conference room realized the past they thought they understood had been missing one silent witness, whose decision that night had changed all of their lives forever. The conference room became so quiet that the soft hum of the computer seemed unnaturally loud. Every eye remained locked on the security footage as the second camera angle revealed the figure standing silently outside the rehearsal room. For several long seconds, no one recognized him because he kept his head lowered beneath a baseball cap. Then he slowly stepped forward into the light. TAEHYUNG's eyes widened first. "Wait!" he whispered. Jin instinctively leaned closer to the screen. RM's expression immediately changed. Even SUGA looked genuinely surprised. Jimin stared at the monitor without blinking. Jungkook slowly sat straighter in his chair, despite the doctor's earlier warning. None of them had expected to see the former performance director who had quietly resigned from the company years earlier. He wasn't standing there by accident. According to the timestamp, he had witnessed the entire incident from the hallway without interrupting. The old security recording continued. Through the hallway camera, everyone watched him hesitate for several seconds before opening the rehearsal room door. Inside the video, Jimin was helping Jungkook sit against the wall while checking his breathing. Jungkook looked exhausted but remained conscious. The former director quietly walked over and knelt beside them. Although the security cameras had no audio, his calm expression suggested he was speaking gently rather than panicking. The three of them remained together for several minutes before the director carefully handed Jimin a folded sheet of paper. The room watched in complete silence. RM frowned. "That's the letter." Jimin slowly nodded. "The original one." The recording continued. Jungkook slowly stood with Jimin's support while the director remained nearby in case he lost his balance again. Before leaving the rehearsal room, the director placed one reassuring hand on both of their shoulders. The image froze naturally as the recording ended. No dramatic music, no hidden confrontation, just one quiet moment from years ago that no one else had ever seen. The technician looked toward Jimin. "There's another file." Everyone turned back to the computer screen. Beneath the security footage was a second video labeled Private Message. Unlike the rehearsal recording, this file showed a much more recent creation date. The timestamp revealed it had been recorded only 3 days earlier. Jimin looked visibly confused. 3 days ago," the technician nodded. "That's what the file says." RM slowly folded his arms. "Then he recorded this shortly before sending the package." Jimin took a slow breath before quietly saying, "Play it." The screen faded to black once more before revealing the former director sitting alone inside a small office. He looked older than everyone remembered, but his calm eyes remained exactly the same. He smiled gently at the camera before speaking. "If you're watching this," he began, "then I'm sorry it took me so many years to contact you." His voice carried no anger or sadness, only quiet sincerity. Jimin, Jungkook, and to everyone else standing beside them. Every member instinctively exchanged surprised glances. He knew they would all be together. The former director continued. "I debated for a long time whether I should ever send this." He looked down briefly before smiling again. After hearing about Jungkook's recent hospitalization, he paused. "I realized silence had already lasted long enough." Everyone listened carefully. "The security footage you just watched wasn't meant to expose anyone." He gently shook his head. "I kept it because I wanted both of you to remember something important." The video briefly zoomed closer. "That night," he continued, "I saw 2 young men trying to protect each other with everything they had." Jimin quietly lowered his eyes. One refused to admit he needed help. The former director looked directly into the camera. The other refused to admit he couldn't carry everything alone. Jungkook slowly smiled through tired eyes. "He understood us better than we understood ourselves." The recording continued. "I thought time would teach both of you that protecting someone doesn't mean destroying yourself." His expression softened. "Instead," he sighed quietly, "I watched from afar as you both continued making exactly the same mistake." RM looked toward Jimin and Jungkook. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to deny. The former director smiled sadly. You probably wondered why I resigned. Everyone remained silent. The truth is, he looked down for several seconds. I didn't leave because of work. JIMIN frowned slightly. I left because I realized I had spent years telling artists to be strong. He paused. Without teaching them that asking for help is also strength. The room became silent again. Even the specialist slowly nodded to himself. The former director continued. I carried that regret for a long time. He looked directly into the camera again. So today, I'm asking all of you not to repeat my mistake. His eyes seemed unusually warm despite the distance created by the screen. Take care of each other, he smiled gently, but never at the cost of yourselves. JIMIN quietly wiped another tear from his face. Jungkook looked at him before quietly whispering, we should have listened. JIMIN gave a small nod. Years ago. The video approached its end. The former director reached toward the camera as if adjusting it before speaking one final time. There's one last thing you deserve to know. Everyone instinctively focused even more closely on the screen. After I resigned, he said calmly, I stayed in contact with someone inside the company. RM frowned. Someone inside, the former director nodded. Not because I wanted information. He smiled faintly. Because I wanted updates on whether the two of you were finally learning to rely on the people around you. TAEHYUNG quietly looked toward RM. Jin exchanged another glance with SUGA. J-Hope slowly crossed his arms. The former director continued. For years, that person kept sending me only one answer. He paused briefly before quietly repeating it. They're still protecting everyone except themselves. The room fell silent. JIMIN slowly lowered his head. Jungkook quietly closed his eyes. The sentence described them perfectly. The former director took one final breath before smiling warmly into the camera. But yesterday, his smile grew slightly brighter. For the first time, everyone waited. That same person sent me a different message. He looked directly into the lens. I think they're finally ready to tell the truth. The recording ended. The monitor faded back to black. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence inside the conference room was no longer filled with fear but with reflection. They had finally uncovered every hidden confession, every misunderstanding, and every sacrifice. Yet as RM quietly removed the USB drive from the computer, a folded sheet of paper slid from a hidden compartment inside the protective case. Across the top was printed one short sentence in the former director's handwriting. If you truly want to know who never stopped protecting all of you, turn this page over. The folded paper remained in RM's hands as every person in the conference room stared at it without saying a word. After everything they had discovered inside the hospital, no one expected another surprise. Yet the sentence written across the front made everyone's heartbeat quicken once again. If you truly want to know who never stopped protecting all of you, turn this page over. RM slowly looked toward JIMIN. Should I? JIMIN quietly nodded. We've come this far. RM carefully turned the page over. Instead of another letter, a single photograph had been attached to the back. The image was several years old, slightly faded around the edges, and obviously printed from a security camera. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. All 7 BTS members were leaving the practice building late at night after a rehearsal. Everyone looked exhausted, but they were laughing together as they walked toward the parking area. Jin immediately smiled. I remember that day. J-Hope quietly nodded. We practiced until almost sunrise. TAEHYUNG leaned closer to the photograph. Why would he keep this? RM continued studying the picture. Suddenly he noticed something unusual in the background. Near the building entrance, partially hidden behind a pillar, stood the former performance director. He wasn't looking at the camera. He wasn't looking at the parking lot. He was looking only at the 7 members walking away together. Beneath the photograph, written in neat handwriting, was a short sentence. This was the night I decided my job was finished. RM quietly read the sentence aloud. The room fell silent. JIMIN frowned slightly. Finished? The specialist gently asked. Is there anything written underneath? RM looked again. There was another paragraph, smaller than the first. He slowly began reading. People often believe protecting someone means standing in front of them when danger appears. I learned something different. Real protection is helping people become strong enough to protect each other after you're gone. No one interrupted. RM continued. When I took this photograph, I finally understood that my responsibility had ended because the 7 of you had already become each other's safest place. Jungkook quietly lowered his eyes. SUGA slowly exhaled. Jin wiped away another tear. The sentence carried a quiet truth that none of them had fully appreciated before. The former director had never believed he was their greatest source of strength. He believed they had always been strongest when they leaned on one another. RM reached the final paragraph. If you're reading this today, then something painful must have happened. But please don't let that pain erase everything you've already survived together. Don't remember yourselves only through hospitals, tears, and regret. Remember the laughter too, because that's the reason all of you kept fighting in the first place. Complete silence filled the conference room. JIMIN slowly smiled through tears. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, the memories flooding back into his mind were not filled with fear. He remembered late-night rehearsals where everyone collapsed onto the practice room floor laughing because nobody could remember the choreography anymore. He remembered Jin bringing food after midnight because everyone had forgotten to eat. He remembered RM encouraging the members after difficult performances. He remembered J-Hope refusing to let anyone practice while injured. He remembered TAEHYUNG making everyone laugh whenever the atmosphere became too heavy. He remembered SUGA quietly staying behind after everyone else left just to make sure no one walked home alone. And he remembered Jungkook smiling with complete freedom before fear had slowly taken over their lives. Jungkook quietly looked around the room as though the same memories had returned to him. We forgot that version of ourselves, he whispered. RM smiled gently. Maybe not forgot. He looked toward Jungkook. Maybe we were just too busy surviving. The specialist slowly closed his leather case. That's something I hope changes after today. Jungkook's mother stepped closer to the group. Her voice was calm now, no longer trembling with fear. Watching all of you today, she smiled sadly. I finally understand why my son always called you his family. No one answered immediately. The meaning of the word family suddenly felt much deeper than before. It wasn't simply about sharing success or standing together on stage. It was about staying together through mistakes, misunderstandings, and moments when everyone felt too broken to stand alone. JIMIN quietly looked toward Jungkook. I'm sorry. Jungkook immediately shook his head. No more apologies. JIMIN smiled faintly. Then thank you. Jungkook smiled back. For what? JIMIN laughed softly through tears. For staying. Jungkook's answer came without hesitation. I never planned to leave. A warm silence settled over the room. Even the doctors quietly stepped back, allowing the members to simply exist together without another medical discussion or another difficult decision. The fear that had controlled the entire day slowly gave way to something much quieter. Relief, hope, gratitude. As everyone prepared to leave the conference room, RM carefully placed the photograph and handwritten note back inside the envelope. Just before closing it, another small object slipped out unnoticed. It landed softly near the edge of the table. TAEHYUNG bent down to pick it up. There's something else. Everyone turned toward him. Resting in his hand was an old silver key attached to a faded keychain. The keychain carried only one engraving, Practice Room B7. Jin looked surprised. That room was closed years ago. SUGA slowly frowned. I thought the locks had all been replaced. TAEHYUNG carefully turned the key over. Attached to it was a tiny handwritten tag. He quietly read the words aloud. Some memories should never stay locked forever. The room became silent one last time. RM slowly looked toward JIMIN and Jungkook before quietly saying, I think this story isn't over yet. JIMIN gently closed his hand around the old silver key, deep inside. He felt that whatever waited behind the forgotten door of Practice Room B7 would not simply reveal another memory from the past. It would uncover the final truth that connected every hidden promise, every sacrifice, and every tear they had shed throughout the years. JIMIN quietly closed his fingers around the old silver key as everyone stood motionless inside the conference room. No one questioned where they were going next. The answer seemed obvious. Whatever the former performance director had wanted them to discover had been waiting behind the locked door of Practice Room B7 for years. The hospital specialist gently closed his leather case before looking at Jungkook. You're still a patient, he reminded him calmly. Jungkook smiled with quiet determination. I know, the senior doctor folded his arms. You are not leaving this hospital tonight. Jungkook nodded without arguing. I'm not asking to. He slowly looked toward JIMIN. But I think it's time someone opened that room. RM understood immediately. We'll go together. JIMIN hesitated for only a moment before shaking his head. No, everyone looked at him. This started with Jungkook and me. He smiled gently toward the members. But it belongs to all of us now. Jin placed a reassuring hand on Jimin's shoulder. Then none of us stays behind. SUGA quietly nodded. We've already spent too much time carrying things separately. TAEHYUNG smiled faintly. This time we walk together. J-Hope looked around the room before adding, no secrets. Everyone quietly agreed. Later that evening, after Jungkook had been moved to a private recovery room and cleared to rest under medical supervision, RM, Jin, SUGA, J-Hope, TAEHYUNG, and Jimin left the hospital carrying the old key and the sealed envelope. Jungkook remained behind, but before they left, he gently stopped Jimin. When you open that door, he said softly, don't look for another reason to blame yourself. Jimin smiled with tired eyes. I'll try. Jungkook quietly laughed. No. He squeezed Jimin's hand once. Promise me. Jimin looked at him for several long seconds before nodding. I promise. Nearly an hour later, they arrived at the familiar company building. The hallways were almost empty, illuminated only by the soft overnight lights. Everything felt strangely smaller than they remembered, yet every corner carried memories of countless rehearsals, laughter, frustration, and dreams. They walked together without speaking until they reached the far end of an older practice wing. There, behind a narrow hallway rarely used anymore, stood a wooden door covered with a thin layer of dust. A small metal plate confirmed the faded engraving. Practice room B7. TAEHYUNG quietly exhaled. I haven't been here in years. RM slowly reached toward the doorknob before stopping. He looked at Jimin. You should do it. Jimin stepped forward. His heartbeat echoed in his ears as he inserted the silver key into the old lock. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then came a soft metallic click. The lock turned smoothly, as though it had been waiting all this time for exactly this key. Jimin slowly pushed the door open. Warm moonlight streamed through a high window, revealing a room frozen in time. Mirrors lined one wall. The old wooden floor still carried faint marks from years of rehearsals. A forgotten speaker rested quietly in one corner. Nothing looked dramatic, nothing looked mysterious. It simply looked untouched. Jin smiled sadly. It feels like yesterday. SUGA slowly walked toward the center of the room. This place remembers everything. As everyone quietly looked around, J-Hope noticed a small wooden box sitting beneath the mirror. Over here. The others gathered beside him. The box was simple, without any lock. Resting on top was another handwritten note from the former director. Jimin carefully unfolded it and read aloud. If you found this room, then you already discovered the truth I wanted you to remember. The greatest performances were never created because each of you was perfect. They happened because every time one of you became tired, someone else quietly carried the rhythm until everyone could stand together again. The room fell silent. Inside the wooden box were old rehearsal schedules, faded photographs, handwritten encouragement notes exchanged between members, and a collection of small memories that had never been meant for the public. There was even a worn notebook filled with positive messages left anonymously after difficult practice days. RM smiled as he recognized familiar handwriting from different members. We were leaving these for each other. Jin laughed softly. Looks like we were. Jimin turned another page and found a short message written years earlier. If today feels too heavy, don't carry it alone tomorrow. He looked up slowly. We wrote this long before any of us forgot how to follow it. No one answered, because everyone knew it was true. They had once understood the importance of leaning on one another. Over time, success, pressure, and fear had buried that simple lesson beneath silence. Jimin gently closed the notebook and looked around the room one last time. Maybe this wasn't about finding another secret, he said quietly. Maybe it was about remembering who we already were. RM nodded with a warm smile. And who we can be again. As they quietly switched off the lights and prepared to leave practice room B7 together, the old room stood exactly as they found it. No longer a place hiding unanswered questions, but a quiet reminder that the strongest bonds are not built by carrying every burden alone, but by trusting the people beside you enough to share it. The hospital lights slowly faded behind them as a new morning began. For the first time in months, no one was carrying the truth alone. The accusations had ended. The hidden promises had been spoken aloud. The misunderstandings had finally been replaced with honesty. Jungkook had chosen to stop hiding his pain. Jimin had finally accepted that protecting someone should never mean sacrificing himself. RM, Jin, SUGA, J-Hope, and TAEHYUNG silently made one promise to each other, that if even one member started carrying too much again, The others would never look away. Several weeks later, Jungkook walked out of the hospital with a genuine smile, welcomed by his members instead of cameras. JIMIN stood beside him, no longer pretending to be stronger than he really was. This time, when someone asked, "Are you okay?" neither of them answered automatically. They answered honestly. Jungkook's mother quietly approached JIMIN one last time before everyone left. She smiled through tears and gently said, "Thank you for protecting my son. But from now on, let us protect both of you." JIMIN simply nodded. No speeches. No dramatic promises. Just quiet understanding. As they walked away together, the morning sunlight stretched across the hospital entrance, reminding all of them that healing was never about forgetting the pain. It was about refusing to face it alone ever again. The end.